What happens when the most powerful government on Earth has the ability to classify its own crimes? Not hypothetically, not in some dystopian novel. Right here, in the United States. The country that classifies new government records roughly 3 times every second. That's not an exaggeration. That's a documented statistic. 50 to 90 million new classified documents every single year, stacked on top of decades worth of secrets that came before them. Now, here's what's interesting about declassification. When a document finally gets released, sometimes 20, 30, 40 years after the fact, the public treats it like breaking news. But the people inside the system, they knew all along. The generals knew, the directors knew, the presidents. Well, some of them knew. And some of them were the ones who signed the orders in the first place. Tonight, we're going to walk through 35 of the most disturbing secrets the United States government ever kept from its own citizens. These aren't conspiracy theories. These aren't rumors from anonymous message boards. Every single one of these was eventually declassified, investigated, and in most cases, formally admitted to by the government itself. We're talking about mind control brothels, a 40-year medical experiment on men who were never told they were sick, government scientists who literally snatched the bones of dead children without their families' knowledge, Pentagon generals who proposed bombing American cities and blaming it on Cuba, Nazi war criminals who were given new identities and put in charge of the space program, and a war that killed 3 million people, started by a lie. So settle in, get comfortable, because these are the files they didn't want you to read. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Now, before we begin, a question for the boardroom. Of all the government secrets you've ever learned about, which one changed the way you see the world? I'll go first. For me, it was Tuskegee. Not because it was the most dramatic. There are flashier stories in this video, but because of the duration. A 40-year study where the sick patients were never given the cure. That's not a rogue operation. That's an institution comfortable with what it's doing. That realization that the system wasn't broken, it was working as designed, changed how I read every government statement that followed. Drop yours in the comments. I read every one. For tonight, for this moment, let's step away from the noise. If you're holding your phone, set it down. Break the cycle of the endless scroll, the digital static, and the brain rot that clutters the mind after a long day. This is your time to disconnect. March 8th, 1971. The biggest boxing match of the century is about to begin. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. 15 rounds. Undefeated versus undefeated. The entire country is watching. Well, almost the entire country. In Media, Pennsylvania, a quiet suburb about 20 miles west of Philadelphia, 8 people are not watching the fight. They're busy. A cab driver, a daycare center director, 2 college professors, a social worker, 3 others. Ordinary people, not spies, not operatives, not trained agents. They've chosen this night specifically because of the fight. They know that every FBI agent in the Philadelphia field office will be glued to a television set. The office will be empty. And so, while Ali and Frazier trade blows in New York, 8 citizens of the United States break into their own government's surveillance headquarters. They pick the lock. They walk in, and they walk out with over 1,000 classified documents. What those documents revealed would become the biggest FBI scandal in American history. The program was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, and it had been running in secret since 1956, 15 years. No congressional authorization, no judicial oversight, no legal basis whatsoever. Now, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI didn't create COINTELPRO to fight crime. They created it to fight ideas. The program's stated mission, in the FBI's own internal documents, was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize movements and individuals the Bureau considered threats. Not criminal threats, ideological threats. The targets? Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, black liberation movements, the American Indian movement, feminist organizations, socialist and communist groups. Essentially, anyone who challenged the established power structure and the tactics. Well, here's where it gets truly dark. Let me start with Fred Hampton. December 4th, 1969, Chicago. Fred Hampton was 21 years old. 21. He was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and by all accounts, he was extraordinary. Charismatic, organized, effective. He'd brokered a non-aggression pact between rival street gangs. He'd started a free breakfast program for children. He was building a multiracial coalition, the Rainbow Coalition, he called it, that united black, white, and Latino activists. The FBI considered him a threat of the highest order. An FBI informant named William O'Neill had infiltrated the Panthers, not as a low-level foot soldier, as the head of Hampton's personal security. O'Neill was being paid by the Bureau, and in the days before December 4th, he provided the FBI with a detailed floor plan of Hampton's apartment. On that floor plan, he marked the location of Hampton's bed. The night of December 3rd, O'Neill slipped a heavy dose of barbiturates into Hampton's drink. Hampton fell asleep. He would not wake up on his own. At 4:45 a.m., a team of 14 officers operating on intelligence provided by the FBI raided the apartment. They fired between 90 and 99 shots. The Panthers fired one into the ceiling. That was the full extent of the shootout that police would later describe to the press. Hampton was shot twice in the head while unconscious in his bed. He was 21 years old. The FBI paid William O'Neill a $300 bonus, and in the files, a letter from Hoover's own desk thanked the handling agent for exemplary efforts. O'Neill lived with this for 2 decades. On January 15th, 1990, Martin Luther King Day, of all days, he ran into traffic on Interstate 290 in Chicago. He was 40 years old. Now, Hampton's assassination was horrific, but it wasn't the FBI's most psychologically cruel operation. That distinction belongs to what they did to Martin Luther King Jr. By 1963, Hoover had authorized wiretaps on King's home and office phones. Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally signed off on the surveillance, on a trial basis, he said. Hoover, characteristically, interpreted this as an invitation to go further. He extended the clearance to be, in his words, unshackled. When the wiretaps captured evidence of King's extramarital affairs, the FBI shifted from surveillance to active psychological warfare. They bugged hotel rooms. They paid informants. They compiled a dossier that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal destruction. And then, in November of 1964, just weeks before King was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, an anonymous package arrived at King's home. Inside was a letter and a tape recording. The letter called King evil and a fraud. It catalogued his personal failings in graphic detail, and it ended with a line that, even decades later, reads like something out of a horror film. There is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. King identified the sender immediately. He knew it was the FBI. The full, uncensored text of that letter wasn't recovered until 2014, when historian Beverly Gage found it in Hoover's files at the National Archives. J. Edgar Hoover personally signed off on the blackmail operation. But COINTELPRO didn't stop at King and Hampton. The program cast a vast net. John Seberg, a Hollywood actress. She donated money to the Black Panthers. Not an illegal act, not even a controversial one by today's standards. The FBI responded by planting a false story in the press claiming that her unborn child had been fathered by a Black Panther member. The story was picked up by gossip columnists. Seberg went into premature labor from the stress. The baby died. Seberg's body was found in Paris in 1979. She was 40 years old. The circumstances were suspicious. The FBI admitted responsibility for the defamation 6 days after her body was discovered. Then there's Malcolm X. The FBI had 9 undercover agents in the Audubon Ballroom on the day Malcolm was shot. His personal security team had been arrested on minor charges just days before the assassination, leaving him exposed. 2 men were wrongly convicted and spent decades in prison. They were finally exonerated in 2021 after the district attorney acknowledged that the FBI and NYPD had withheld exculpatory evidence. And then there were Hoover's personal files. 17,700 pages of derogatory information on presidents, first ladies, Supreme Court justices, and senators. Author Ronald Kessler, who studied the files extensively, concluded they could have been gathered for no other purpose than blackmail. A second set of files, reportedly even more sensitive, was destroyed by Hoover's personal secretary immediately after his death in 1972. Whatever was in those files, we'll never know. And the 8 people who broke into that office in Media, Pennsylvania? The FBI launched one of the largest investigations in its history to find them. They never did. The burglars' identities remained secret for 43 years, until they voluntarily came forward in 2014. They were never charged, and the documents they stole changed American history. The year is 1932. The place is Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest counties in the poorest region of the United States. The Great Depression is crushing the country. But for black sharecroppers in rural Alabama, economic devastation isn't new. It's generational. It's structural. It's the only reality most of them have ever known. Into this landscape comes the United States Public Health Service with an offer that sounds, on its face, like a godsend. Free medical examinations, free meals on clinic days, free burial insurance, which, in a community where families often couldn't afford to bury their dead, was a powerful incentive. 399 men signed up. All black, all poor, all infected with syphilis, and not one of them was told what they actually had. The study was titled, and I want you to hear the clinical detachment in this, Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro. That title tells you everything about how the researchers viewed their subjects, not as patients, not as people, as data points in a racial medical taxonomy that the Public Health Service wanted to map. Now, the original plan was supposed to last 6 months, just a short observational study, but something happened that changed everything. The researchers realized that they had a unique opportunity, a captive population of untreated syphilis patients who trusted them completely. So 6 months became a year became a decade became 40 years. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, these men were systematically deceived. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a colloquial term that covered everything from anemia to fatigue. They were given aspirin, mineral supplements, placebos. They were never given the one thing that could have saved their lives. And here's where it crosses from neglect into something far darker. In 1943, penicillin was identified as an effective treatment for syphilis. By 1945, it was the standard of care, widely available, affordable, proven. The study's subjects should have been treated immediately. They weren't. Not only were they not given penicillin, the researchers actively prevented them from receiving treatment elsewhere. When some of the men were drafted during World War II, the Public Health Service sent letters to the local draft board requesting they be excluded from military service, because military induction would have meant mandatory syphilis treatment. Let that sink in. The government intervened to keep these men sick. There's one figure in this story who haunts the narrative in a way that resists easy categorization. Her name was Eunice Rivers, a black nurse from the Tuskegee Institute. Rivers was the only staff member involved for the entire 40-year duration of the study. She was chauffeur, interpreter, and liaison, the human bridge between the researchers and the men they were studying. Every clinic visit, she was there. Every meal, she served it. Every aspirin, she dispensed it. And every year, for 4 decades, she knew those men weren't getting real treatment. Now, was she a co-conspirator? Or was she a victim of the same racist system that created the study in the first place? A black woman in the 1930s South who lacked the institutional power to challenge the white physicians running the program? Historians still debate this. What's not debatable is the outcome. Rivers kept the machinery running. She was the trusted face of a program designed to betray trust. By 1972, when the study was finally exposed, the numbers told their own story. 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 more from related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, a disease they inherited because their fathers were denied treatment. Only 74 of the original 399 were still alive. So, how did it finally end? Not through institutional conscience, not through oversight, through one man's refusal to stay quiet. His name was Peter Buxton, and in 1966, he was a 28-year-old epidemiologist working for the Public Health Service in San Francisco. He'd heard about the study from co-workers, just casual conversation. the way you might mention a project you're aware of. But Buxton couldn't let it go. He filed an official protest through the chain of command. The response: his concerns were reviewed by a panel of physicians who concluded that the study should continue. Their reasoning was genuinely chilling. The experiment, they argued, was not yet complete. They wanted to follow the men until all of them were dead and then perform autopsies. That was the scientific endpoint they were waiting for. Death. Buxton waited 6 years. He tried internal channels again. Nothing changed. Finally, in 1972, he leaked the story to an Associated Press reporter named Jean Heller. On July 25th, the story ran in the Washington Star. The next day, it was front-page news in the New York Times. The public reaction was exactly what you'd expect: horror, outrage, demands for accountability. The study was terminated immediately. Congressional hearings followed. A $10 million settlement was eventually paid to the survivors and their families. And in 1997, 25 years after the exposure, President Bill Clinton stood in the White House and offered a formal apology. By then, only 8 of the original study participants were still alive to hear it. But here's the detail that should keep you up at night. The lead researcher on a related program, a man named John Charles Cutler, didn't just participate in Tuskegee. He went on to run another unethical experiment, this one in Guatemala, which we'll get to later in this video. Same man, same pattern, same institutional indifference. A 2016 study, decades after the fact, found that the disclosure of the Tuskegee experiment is still driving medical mistrust among Black Americans. The study didn't just damage 400 men, it damaged an entire community's relationship with medicine, and that damage hasn't healed. That's not a historical footnote. That's a wound that's still open. In 1953, a CIA chemist named Sidney Gottlieb did something that sounds like it belongs in a spy novel. He arranged for the Central Intelligence Agency to purchase the entire world's supply of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, from its European manufacturers. $240,000, every last microgram. Why would an intelligence agency need all the LSD on the planet? Because Sidney Gottlieb believed he was going to crack the code of the human mind. The program was called MKUltra, and it would become the most extensive and most disturbing behavioral modification program in American history. Over $25 million in funding. More than 80 universities and institutions participating. Nearly 150 sub-projects spanning everything from hypnosis to electroshock therapy to LSD. The premise was deceptively simple. The Cold War was at its most paranoid. The CIA was convinced that the Soviets and Chinese had developed mind control techniques. Brainwashing, they called it. American POWs returning from Korea showed signs of ideological conversion. The agency believed it was falling behind in a psychic arms race. And so MKUltra was born, not as a defensive program, as an offensive one. Gottlieb and his team weren't trying to protect American minds. They were trying to learn how to break them. Now, some of the experiments were conducted on willing participants, soldiers and CIA employees who volunteered, though the degree of informed consent is highly debatable. But many of the subjects had no idea what was being done to them. LSD was administered to unknowing individuals at universities, at CIA facilities, in secret detention centers overseas. In some of those overseas facilities, people deemed expendable were subjected to combinations of drugs, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and extremes of temperature. The documentation on these sites is sparse because, well, we'll get to that. But the most cinematically disturbing element of MKUltra was a sub-project that operated under a name that sounds like it was invented by a screenwriter. Operation Midnight Climax. From 1954 to 1965, the CIA operated a network of safe houses, essentially government-run brothels, in San Francisco, Mill Valley, and New York City. The setup was straightforward in its depravity. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll, paid $100 per subject, would lure men from local bars back to the safe house. Once there, the men were secretly dosed with LSD, and then they were watched. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA agent George Hunter White would observe the subjects' reactions, often with a martini in hand and a pitcher at his side. White was a former narcotics agent who'd been recruited specifically for this work. He was, by all accounts, enthusiastic about it. The San Francisco safe house was located at 225 Chestnut Street in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood. It was decorated to look like a high-end apartment, thick carpets, framed prints, mood lighting. A honey trap with a medical purpose. Or at least, that's what the agency told itself. No consent was obtained. No medical supervision was provided. The men, ordinary citizens whose only crime was accepting a drink, were experimented on and then sent home. We have no idea how many there were. But the darkest chapter of MKUltra centers on one man, Frank Olson. Olson was an Army bacteriologist and a CIA officer stationed at Fort Detrick, the military's biological weapons facility in Maryland. On November 19, 1953, Olson attended a retreat at Deep Creek Lake with a group of CIA scientists. At that retreat, Sidney Gottlieb secretly dosed Olson's drink with LSD. What happened next is a matter of considerable dispute. According to Gottlieb's later testimony, Olson experienced a severe psychological reaction. He became paranoid, agitated, delusional. Over the following 9 days, he deteriorated rapidly. He was taken to New York City, ostensibly to see a physician. On November 28, 1953, at 2:25 in the morning, Frank Olson plunged from the window of room 1018A at the Hotel Statler, now the Hotel Pennsylvania, falling 13 stories to the sidewalk below. His CIA minder, Robert Lashbrook, was in the room at the time. The phone call Lashbrook made afterward was intercepted by the hotel operator. Lashbrook said only 2 words: "He's gone." The response from the other end? Well, that's too bad. The government initially ruled Olson's death as suicide. Then they reclassified it as misadventure. Olson's family accepted the official story for decades, but in 1994, Olson's son, Eric, had the body exhumed. A forensic examination found evidence of a cranial hematoma, a blow to the head, that was inconsistent with a fall. The New York District Attorney reclassified the death as cause unknown. Actually, let me correct something here. The circumstances have never been fully resolved. What we know is this: a man was secretly drugged by his own government, suffered a severe psychological crisis, and died under circumstances that the forensic evidence doesn't fully support as self-inflicted. Whether it was murder or a drug-induced psychotic break that led to an accidental fall, the distinction almost doesn't matter. Frank Olson was killed by MKUltra, one way or another. His family received a $750,000 settlement. They also received personal apologies from President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby. The apology was, in effect, an admission. And here's the detail that makes historical accountability almost impossible. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal was consuming the Nixon White House, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of virtually all MKUltra files. He was covering his tracks, not from Congress, but from history. The order was carried out. Boxes upon boxes of records, detailing experiments, subjects, methods, outcomes, were shredded and burned. 20 years of human experimentation reduced to ash. The only reason we know anything about MKUltra is that a set of financial records, about 20,000 documents, had been misfiled in a different archive. They escaped the purge by accident when a Freedom of Information Act request turned them up in 1977. They became the foundation for everything we now know about the program. 20,000 documents out of what was likely hundreds of thousands. We know only a fraction of what MKUltra actually did. We will likely never know the full scope. The man who ordered the destruction, Richard Helms, was never prosecuted for it. He was fined $2,000 and given a suspended sentence for lying to Congress about the CIA's role in Chile. See, that's the pattern. And if you're paying attention, you've already noticed it. The experiments happen in secret. The documents are destroyed. A fraction survives by accident. The public learns about it decades later. The apologies come. The settlements are paid. And nobody goes to prison. Nobody ever goes to prison. George Hunter White, the man behind the two-way mirrors at Midnight Climax, retired from government service and wrote in his final letter to Gottlieb, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Fun, fun. Fun." That's how he described it. Sidney Gottlieb retired to a farm in Virginia, where he raised goats and practiced folk dancing. He died in 1999. He was never charged with a crime. The program that broke minds, destroyed lives, and murdered at least one man ended with a pension and a hobby farm. And the files that could have told us the full truth, they were ashes before anyone thought to look. In 2010, a medical historian named Susan Reverby was doing something routine. She was sorting through the archived papers of a deceased researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, a man named John Charles Cutler. Reverby had been studying the Tuskegee experiment for years. She knew Cutler's name. He'd been involved in Tuskegee, but what she found in those Pittsburgh archives wasn't about Alabama. It was about Guatemala. And it was, in many ways, worse. Between 1946 and 1948, let me repeat those dates because they matter. The United States Public Health Service ran a series of experiments in Guatemala, in which over 5,500 people were subjected to medical research. At least 1,308 of them were deliberately infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. The subjects included soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, orphan children, and inmates of mental institutions. None of them gave informed consent. Most of them had no idea what was being done to their bodies. Now, the methods. And I want to warn you, this is difficult material. Researchers infected subjects through sexual contact with prostitutes who were themselves carriers. When that wasn't efficient enough, they moved to direct application, smearing bacteria on open cuts and wounds, inserting bacteria into the eyes, the rectum, the urethra. In some cases, they scraped the skin off patients' penises and dripped infectious solution directly onto the raw, exposed tissue for 1 to 2 hours. They also injected syphilis bacteria mixed with beef, heart broth, distilled water, or spinal fluid directly into subjects' bodies. Of the 1,308 people infected, only 700 received any treatment at all. The rest were simply left. By 1953, 83 people had died, though the direct causal connection to the experiments is uncertain for all of them. Now here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. Remember those dates? 1946 to 1948. You know what else was happening between 1946 and 1948? The Nuremberg doctors' trial. From December 1946 to August 1947, 23 German physicians were prosecuted at Nuremberg for conducting medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The entire civilized world was watching. The United States was leading the prosecution. American lawyers stood in that courtroom and argued that what the Nazi doctors had done, experimenting on captive, powerless human beings without their consent, was a crime against humanity. And at the same time, quite literally, the same months, American researchers were doing functionally identical things in Guatemala. Different country, different victims. Same pattern, same contempt for human subjects, same institutional machinery, grinding through bodies that had been deemed expendable. The study was originally attempted in the United States, at a prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. But it was moved to Guatemala specifically, and the records are clear on this, to avoid ethical constraints, legal consequences, and bad publicity. They knew it was wrong. They knew it would cause an outcry if discovered, so they moved it somewhere the victims couldn't complain. And the man who ran it, John Charles Cutler, the same John Charles Cutler who would go on to participate in the Tuskegee study. Same researcher, same methodology, same institutional indifference to the bodies he was using. When Reverby published her findings in 2010, the reaction was swift. President Obama called Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom to personally apologize. NIH Director Francis Collins called the experiments deeply disturbing. A presidential commission was appointed to investigate. But here's what didn't happen. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody went to prison. Cutler himself died in 2003, 7 years before his Guatemala work was discovered. He never faced any consequences. The pattern holds, always. In 1985, a Bible arrived in Tehran. It had a handwritten inscription from the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, a personal gift delivered as part of a secret diplomatic channel that was, at that very moment, violating American law, undermining American foreign policy, and funding a covert war in Central America with drug money. Welcome to Iran-Contra, the scandal that should have ended a presidency and somehow didn't. Here's what happened. The Reagan administration wanted two things that were legally incompatible. First, they wanted to free American hostages as being held by Iranian-backed groups in Lebanon. Second, they wanted to fund the Contras, right-wing rebel forces fighting to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The problem? Congress had explicitly banned military aid to the Contras through the Boland Amendment, and Iran was under a strict arms embargo. Selling weapons to Iran was illegal. Funding the Contras was illegal. Doing both at the same time, using the proceeds from one to finance the other, was creative, I'll give them that. The scheme was orchestrated primarily through the National Security Council, with Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North as the operational point man. North reported to National Security Advisor John Poindexter, who reported to the President. The chain of command was short and deliberate. Here's how it worked. The U.S. sold weapons, including TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk surface-to-air missiles, to Iran through intermediaries, primarily Israel. The profits from those sales were then secretly funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua. But the rabbit hole goes deeper. Oliver North's personal notebooks, which were later subpoenaed by investigators, contained references to $14 million in drug money being used to supplement Contra funding. The CIA and State Department officials had, according to multiple investigations, knowingly facilitated drug shipments into the United States to generate revenue for the Contra war effort. Let me say that again. Government officials facilitated drug trafficking into their own country to fund an illegal war. When the story broke in late 1986, the scramble to cover tracks was almost comical in its desperation. North and his secretary, Fawn Hall, spent days shredding documents. When the shredder jammed under the volume, Hall began smuggling documents out of the White House in her boots and under her clothing. Reagan initially denied everything. We did not, repeat, did not, trade weapons or anything else for hostages, he said in a nationally televised address. Months later, he revised his position. He didn't recall. His memory wasn't clear. He might have been informed, but he didn't remember the details. The congressional investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately toothless. National Security Advisor Poindexter resigned. Oliver North was convicted on 3 felony counts: obstruction, destruction of documents, and accepting an illegal gratuity. His convictions were later overturned on a technicality. And then came the pardons. On Christmas Eve 1992, his last month in office, President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 Iran-Contra figures, including former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was about to begin. Bush himself had been Reagan's vice president during the affair. The independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, called the pardons the last act of a cover-up. See, here's what makes Iran-Contra so important for understanding how power actually works in Washington. Nearly everyone involved went on to have successful careers afterward. Elliott Abrams, who pled guilty to withholding information from Congress, was later appointed special envoy to Venezuela. John Negroponte, who was ambassador to Honduras during the Contra supply operations, became the first director of national intelligence. Oliver North became a Fox News commentator and president of the NRA. The system doesn't punish its own. It recycles them. In September of 1950, a United States Navy ship sat quietly off the coast of San Francisco. It was conducting what the military would later describe as a vulnerability test. The ship released a 3-mile-long cloud of Serratia marcescens bacteria into the wind, blowing toward the city. Over the next several days, the bacteria drifted across San Francisco. Military scientists at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the Army's biological weapons research facility, later estimated that nearly all of the city's 800,000 residents had inhaled the microorganisms. The bacteria were detected as far as 23 miles inland. The residents of San Francisco were not informed. This was Operation Sea Spray, and it was just one of 239 open-air biological weapons tests that the U.S. military conducted on American cities between 1949 and 1969. Now, the military's position, then and now, was that Serratia marcescens was a harmless simulant, a stand-in for more dangerous pathogens, used to study dispersal patterns without actually endangering anyone. There was just one problem with that theory. People started getting sick. Within days of the test, hospitals in the San Francisco area reported an unusual spike in urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens. 11 patients at Stanford University Hospital were affected. One of them, a man named Edward Nevin, died. Nevin's family later sued the government. The case went all the way to federal court, where the government argued and the judge accepted that the military was immune from liability for actions taken in the name of national security. The family received nothing, but San Francisco wasn't the only target. Not by a long shot. In New York City, Army researchers released bacteria in the subway system to study how biological agents would spread through underground transit networks. Millions of daily commuters were unknowing test subjects. In St. Louis and Minneapolis, the Army sprayed zinc-cadmium sulfide from the rooftops of low-income housing projects. The test sites were predominantly black neighborhoods. Local officials who asked questions were told the spraying was part of an invisible smokescreen test for military radar. It wasn't. At Fort Detrick itself, the research facility known as America's Bioweapons Factory maintained a 1 million-liter metallic sphere called the 8-Ball, inside which volunteer test subjects were exposed to aerosolized pathogens, including Francisella tularensis, the agent that causes tularemia. The facility also produced 5,000 anthrax bombs during World War II, and in a connection that loops back to our earlier chapter on Operation Paperclip, Fort Detrick employed former Nazi scientists who had been recruited under that program, including some who had conducted experiments on concentration camp inmates. During the Offensive Biological Weapons Program's operation from 1942 to 1969, 456 cases of occupational infections were reported at Fort Detrick. At least 3 workers died, one from anthrax and one from machupovirus after being bitten by an infected animal. In 1969, President Nixon ordered the end of the Offensive Biological Weapons Program and the destruction of all stockpiles. And in 1972, the United States signed the Biological Weapons Convention. But here's what nobody cleaned up. When investigators began digging at the Fort Detrick site years later, they unearthed more than 2,000 tons of hazardous waste, including vials of live bacteria and non-virulent anthrax that the military didn't know was buried there. The cleanup is still ongoing. Oh, and one more thing. In 2001, letters containing weaponized anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and 2 U.S. senators, killing 5 people. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Amerithrax, eventually concluded that the anthrax came from a flask at the Army's biodefense lab at Fort Detrick. The prime suspect, USAMR IID researcher Bruce Edwards Ivins, killed himself in 2008, just as the FBI was preparing charges. The bioweapons factory that was supposed to have been shut down in 1969 was still the source of the deadliest biological attack on American soil 32 years later. January 24th, 1961. A B-52 Stratofortress bomber is flying a routine airborne alert mission over eastern North Carolina. These flights happened constantly during the Cold War. Nuclear-armed bombers circling in the skies 24 hours a day, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. It's called the Chrome Dome program, and it's considered essential to America's nuclear deterrent. But on this particular night, something goes wrong with the aircraft. A structural failure. The right wing separates from the fuselage at high altitude. The plane breaks apart. 2 objects fall from the disintegrating bomber. Each one is a Mark 39 thermonuclear bomb. Each one carries a yield of approximately 3.8 megatons, 250 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The first bomb's parachute deployed. It floated down and was found hanging in a tree in a tobacco field, intact, recoverable. The second bomb didn't deploy its parachute. It plummeted to Earth at terminal velocity, burying itself deep in a muddy field near Faro, North Carolina. Now, here's the part that nearly ended civilization as we know it. When weapons experts examined the first bomb, the one that landed in the tree, they discovered something that reportedly caused Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to go pale. Of the bombs, 6 independent safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation. 5 had failed. 5 out of 6. The only thing that prevented a 3.8 megaton nuclear explosion over North Carolina. An explosion that would have devastated everything within a 17-mile radius, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and deposited lethal radioactive fallout over Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York was a single low-voltage arming switch. A switch that the military's own engineers had previously flagged as unreliable. A declassified document from Sandia National Laboratories, the agency responsible for nuclear weapons safety, described the Goldsboro incident in terms that leave very little room for interpretation. The bomb was, in their assessment, 1 step away from full nuclear detonation on American soil. The second bomb, the one that hit the ground at terminal velocity, broke apart on impact. Its core, containing highly enriched uranium, plunged approximately 180 feet into the waterlogged earth. Recovery teams dug for months. They retrieved most of the weapon's components. But the core was never fully recovered. The United States government quietly purchased an easement on the surrounding land, prohibiting any excavation below a certain depth. That nuclear core is still there, in a field in North Carolina, right now. And Goldsboro wasn't an isolated incident. The military uses the term broken arrow to describe accidents involving nuclear weapons. Between 1950 and 1980, the Department of Defense has officially acknowledged 32 broken arrow events. Unofficially, the number may be closer to 1,200, but those records remain classified. 6 nuclear weapons have been lost by the United States and never recovered. 6. They're still out there, on the ocean floor, buried in ice, embedded in farmland. The military calls them Empty quivers, which is a remarkably calm euphemism, for we lost a nuclear bomb and can't find it. But lost bombs are just one category of nuclear close calls. The broader picture is even more terrifying. On October the 27th, 1962, the single most dangerous day in human history, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was lurking in the waters near Cuba. American destroyers had detected it and were dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. Inside the submarine, the crew had been submerged for days. They had no communication with Moscow. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures exceeded 140 degrees in some compartments. The submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo. Soviet protocol required the unanimous consent of 3 officers to launch it. 2 of the 3 voted yes. The third, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov was the sole dissenter. If he had voted yes, a nuclear torpedo would have detonated near the American fleet during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The response would have been nuclear. The escalation would have been total. Vasily Arkhipov may have saved the world. He received no medal for it. He died in 1998. Most people have never heard his name. Then there's Stanislav Petrov, September 26, 1983. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, monitoring the early warning satellite system. Just after midnight, his screen lit up. The system detected 5 incoming American intercontinental ballistic missiles heading for the Soviet Union. Protocol demanded he report the launch immediately, which would have triggered a Soviet nuclear counterstrike. Thousands of warheads, hundreds of millions of dead. Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. 5 missiles? An American first strike would involve hundreds, not 5. He judged it a false alarm and chose not to report it through the chain of command. He was right. The satellite system had malfunctioned, mistaking sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. One man's judgment call. That's how close it was. And then there was Able Archer 83, a NATO command exercise in November 1983 that the Soviet Union interpreted as potential cover for an actual first strike. Soviet forces began loading nuclear warheads onto combat aircraft. The world was, once again, one miscalculation away from annihilation. We didn't learn about any of this until decades later. The bombs in the field, the finger on the button, the one man who said no, all of it classified, all of it hidden from the public that was living, sleeping, going to work, raising children, on a planet that came within a single unreliable switch of incineration. Sweet dreams. On January 18, 1955, a group of scientists and government officials gathered for a classified meeting at the Atomic Energy Commission. The topic on the agenda was body snatching, not figuratively, literally. Dr. Willard Libby, a commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing radiocarbon dating, addressed the room. His words, preserved in a declassified transcript, are remarkable in their casual brutality. If anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country. He wasn't joking, and the room didn't laugh. Project Sunshine had begun 2 years earlier, in 1953, with a straightforward scientific problem. Nuclear weapons testing, atmospheric detonations in Nevada, the Pacific, Siberia, was releasing strontium-90 into the global atmosphere. SR-90 is a radioactive isotope that mimics calcium. When ingested through contaminated food or water, it deposits in bones, where it continues to emit radiation for years. And because children's bones are growing rapidly, absorbing calcium at accelerated rates, they accumulate strontium-90 at far higher levels than adults. The AEC needed to know how much strontium-90 was getting into American bodies. How fast was it accumulating? At what point would it become dangerous? To answer that question, they needed human bones. Specifically, they needed the bones of recently deceased people, especially infants and young children from different parts of the world. And so Project Sunshine became, in essence, a global corpse collection operation. Approximately 6,000 bodies were obtained from 26 collection sites around the world. The remains were shipped to laboratories at Columbia University in New York and the University of Chicago, where scientists extracted bone samples for strontium-90 analysis. The families of the dead were not informed. No consent was requested. No consent was given. Dr. Lawrence Culp of Columbia University developed what the declassified documents describe as backdoor channels to obtain cadavers from hospitals in Vancouver, Houston, and New York. The word backdoor is theirs, not mine. They knew they were circumventing normal procedures. They knew they were taking children's remains without authorization. And there was a cover story. Researchers without security clearances, the morticians, the hospital workers, the intermediaries who actually handled the remains, were told that the skeleton collection was for studying naturally occurring radiation, not nuclear fallout, not weapons testing, just routine science. The deception was built into the program's architecture. The program wasn't limited to the United States. International collaboration involved the United Kingdom's Atomic Energy Authority and a parallel program in Australia that ran from 1957 to 1978, amassing thousands of additional samples, many from children. When a Presidential Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments released its findings in 1995, the conclusion was damning. Researchers employed deception in the solicitation of bones of deceased babies from intermediaries with access to human remains. Now, here's the defense that's sometimes offered. The data from Project Sunshine was genuinely valuable. It contributed to our understanding of radiation exposure and played a role in building the scientific case for the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which moved nuclear testing underground and significantly reduced atmospheric contamination. And that's true. The science was useful. But the question isn't whether the data was valuable. The question is whether a government has the right to collect the bones of dead children, secretly, deceptively, without their families' knowledge, because it decided the data was important enough to justify the means. The government's answer, apparently, was yes. A Nobel Prize winner discussing body snatching in a classified meeting. 6,000 corpses shipped to university labs. Grieving families who never knew what happened to their children's remains. All in the name of understanding the fallout from weapons the government itself was detonating. That's Project Sunshine, and it has, genuinely, one of the most Orwellian names in the entire history of classified programs. On March 13th, 1962, a document was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer. It had been reviewed and approved by every member of the Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States. And it proposed something that, even by the standards of Cold War paranoia, was extraordinary. Operation Northwoods was a detailed plan for the United States military to commit acts of terrorism against American citizens and military targets, and blame them on Cuba. The document, which is available in its entirety through the National Security Archive, reads like a menu of atrocities. The proposals included staging bombings in American cities, particularly Miami and Washington, D.C., sinking boats filled with Cuban refugees on the high seas, fabricating the shoot-down of a U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft off the coast of Cuba, remotely controlling civilian aircraft, secretly repainted as U.S. Air Force planes, and then destroying them to simulate Cuban aggression. And, in the document's most chilling passage, what appears to be a reference to orchestrating the deaths of Cuban immigrants on American soil. All of this would be presented to the public and to Congress as unprovoked Cuban aggression, providing the justification for a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. The language of the document is what gets me. It's not heated, it's not ideological, it reads like a business plan. Cost-benefit analysis, logistics, timeline. These weren't fringe conspiracy theorists in a basement. These were the most senior military leaders in the nation's chain of command, calmly proposing the murder of American civilians as a strategic tool. The document was presented to President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. According to historical accounts, McNamara rejected it. Kennedy himself was briefed, and his response was reportedly blunt. "We are not discussing the use of military force." Kennedy subsequently removed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lemnitzer was reassigned to Europe, where he became Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, which is, depending on your perspective, either a demotion or a lateral move to an equally powerful position. The military establishment's view of Kennedy hardened after Northwoods. Multiple sources describe a growing sentiment among senior officers that the president was going soft on Cuba. This was 1962. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed the year before. The Cuban Missile Crisis was months away, and the Pentagon was frustrated with a president who wouldn't greenlight the war they wanted. Operation Northwoods was classified for 35 years. It was first made public in 1997 by the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, a body created to release documents related to Kennedy's assassination. The full text was published by the National Security Archive in 2001. And the significance can't be overstated. This wasn't a hypothetical. This wasn't a war game. This was a signed, approved proposal from the highest levels of the American military establishment. The only thing that prevented it from being executed was one man's refusal. Think about that. One president's no. That's the margin. That's the firewall between a constitutional republic and something else entirely. August 2nd, 1964. The USS Maddox, an American destroyer, is operating in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. It's conducting signals intelligence operations, essentially electronic eavesdropping, as part of a program called DeSoto Patrols. On this day, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approach the Maddox and engage. Torpedoes are fired. The Maddox returns fire, supported by aircraft from the carrier USS Ticonderoga One torpedo boat is sunk. The others are damaged and retreat. This was a real engagement. It happened. There's no dispute about August 2nd. August 4th is a different story. 2 days later, the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy reported that they were under attack again. Radar contacts, sonar signatures, torpedo warnings. The crews went to battle stations and fired into the darkness for hours. But here's the thing. There were no enemy vessels. There was no attack. The radar contacts were false, likely caused by weather effects on the equipment. The sonar operator later admitted he'd been hearing his own ship's propellers. Commander James Stockdale, who was flying overhead in an F-8 Crusader, could see the entire ocean's surface below him, and reported, "I had the best seat in the house to watch that event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets." The August 4th attack never happened. But within hours, President Lyndon Johnson was on national television, telling the American people that their naval forces had been attacked twice in international waters. He called it open aggression on the high seas. On August 7th, just 3 days later, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It passed the House unanimously, 416 to 0. In the Senate, it passed 88 to 2. The only dissenting votes came from Senators Wayne Moss of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, who questioned whether the administration was telling the truth. They were right to question it. The resolution gave the president authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was, in practical terms, a blank check for war, and it was based on a fabrication. Now, it took 41 years for the full truth to emerge. In 2005 and 2006, the NSA declassified nearly 200 documents related to the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. Over 140 of them were previously classified at the top secret level. Among those documents was an internal study by NSA historian Robert J. Hanyuk. Hanyuk's findings were devastating. He concluded that NSA intelligence had been skewed, that analysts had essentially made the signal's intelligence fit the claim of a second attack. Mistaken translations at 2 different NSA intercept stations had been conflated in Washington to create the appearance of attack-related communications that were actually referring to the August 2nd engagement. Only information supporting the attack narrative was presented to senior officials. Contradictory intelligence was suppressed. Relevant reports were, in the study's careful language, concealed from Congress. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara used the fabricated second attack to build the case for military escalation. Years later, in a documentary interview, McNamara himself acknowledged that the August 4th attack had not occurred. The human cost of this lie is almost incomprehensible. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution provided the legal foundation for full-scale American involvement in the Vietnam War. Over the next 11 years, 58,220 American service members were killed. More than 3 million Vietnamese died, soldiers and civilians both. The war consumed 2 presidencies, tore the country apart, and left scars that are still visible in American society today. All of it built on a fabricated attack that took Congress 3 days to authorize, and the NSA 41 years to admit never happened. At the end of World War II, As Allied forces advanced through the ruins of the Third Reich, intelligence officers from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were racing to capture the same prize: Germany's scientists. The Nazis had been ahead of the world in several critical fields: rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, aerospace medicine, biological warfare. And in the post-war scramble for technological advantage against the Soviets, these scientists were more valuable than gold. The American effort was called Operation Paperclip. The name came from an absurdly mundane origin. Paperclips were attached to the security dossiers of scientists flagged as high-priority recruitment targets. The bureaucratic banality of the name would prove darkly fitting. The initial candidates were identified using something called the Ossenberg list, a catalogue of 15,000 German scientists and engineers that was discovered, of all places, in a toilet at the University of Bonn. It had been hidden there, presumably to prevent its capture. American intelligence agents found it anyway. Now, here's where the story takes its turn. President Harry Truman had issued an explicit directive. Nazi Party members and active Nazi supporters were not to be recruited, under no circumstances. This was the official policy of the United States government. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the military organization running Paperclip, ignored it. Not subtly, not in edge cases, systematically. JIOA officials forged documents. They altered security evaluations. They whitewashed war crimes records. They created entirely new identities for scientists whose actual biographies would have disqualified them immediately. Roughly half of the early Paperclip recruits had been members of the Nazi Party. A significant minority had been members of the SS or SA. Some had been directly involved in atrocities. The most famous and most consequential of these recruits was Werner von Braun. Von Braun had been the technical director at the Peenemünde Army Research Center, where Germany developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. He was brilliant. He was also a member of the SS, and his rockets were built by slaves. The V-2 production program was based at a facility called Mittelbau-Dora, an underground factory complex carved into the Harz Mountains. The labor force was drawn from the concentration camp system. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora during its operation. An estimated 20,000 of them died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, beatings, and approximately 350 hangings, 200 of them for suspected sabotage. Here's a statistic that should stop you cold. More people died building the V-2 rocket than were killed by it. Approximately 10,000 slave laborers perished in production. Approximately 2,541 people were killed by V-2 strikes on London, Antwerp, and other targets. The weapon's death toll was higher in the factory than on the battlefield. Von Braun visited the underground factory at least 12 to 15 times. He walked through the sleeping quarters where prisoners were packed into tunnels, lying on bare rock, dying of dysentery and exhaustion. He later claimed he felt helpless to change the situation. After the war, von Braun was brought to the United States under Paperclip. His past was sanitized. His SS membership was expunged from his official file. He was given a new life, a new identity, and virtually unlimited resources to pursue his real passion: spaceflight. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He was the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the launched vehicle that carried American astronauts to the moon. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, it was Werner von Braun's engineering that got him there. The man who built rockets on the backs of concentration camp slaves put America on the moon. And he wasn't alone. Arthur Rudolph, who had been the production manager at Mittelbau-Dora, the person directly responsible for overseeing the slave labor operation, was brought to the United States and eventually became the project director of the Saturn V program. In 1984, when the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations finally caught up with his past, Rudolph agreed to voluntarily leave the country and renounce his American citizenship, rather than face a denaturalization hearing. Kurt Debus, a former member of the SS, became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center. Hubertus Struckhold, who conducted high-altitude and freezing experiments that some historians have linked to concentration camp research, became known as the father of space medicine and had a library named after him at Brooks Air Force Base. The library was renamed in 2006 when his wartime activities became more widely known. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States under Paperclip and its successor programs. They were given homes, salaries, security clearances, and American citizenship. Many became cornerstones of the U.S. defense and space programs. The government that was prosecuting Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg was simultaneously recruiting their colleagues. The government that was building the case for crimes against humanity was quietly employing people who had participated in those very crimes. And here's the final irony. The rockets that took humanity to the stars, the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century, the moment that made an entire species look up in wonder. Those rockets were designed by men who had watched slaves die in underground tunnels. The engineering lineage runs from Mittelbau-Dora to Cape Canaveral, from the concentration camp to the launch pad. You can't separate the triumph from the horror. They're the same story. That's the paperclip paradox. Morality isn't fixed in the corridors of power. It's a variable that adjusts to strategic need. And when the need was great enough, the bodies in the tunnels simply stopped mattering. In the autumn of 1969, a man named Daniel Ellsberg began sneaking documents out of the RAND Corporation. Ellsberg was a military analyst, Harvard PhD, former Marine, former State Department official who'd spent 2 years on the ground in Vietnam studying counterinsurgency. He was, by any measure, an establishment figure, a defense insider. The kind of person who gets invited to classified briefings and reads top-secret cables over morning coffee. But Ellsberg had a problem. He'd read the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, officially titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force, were a classified study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967. McNamara wanted an internal history of American involvement in Vietnam, and he wanted it to be comprehensive. 36 analysts from RAND and the Washington Institute for Defense Analysis spent over a year producing it. The result was 7,000 pages, 47 volumes, a documentary record spanning from 1945 to 1968, from the end of World War II through the Tet Offensive. Ellsberg had been one of the analysts working on the study, and what the study revealed was systemic, deliberate, sustained deception. 4 consecutive presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had systematically lied to the American public and to Congress about the scope, nature, and prospects of American involvement in Vietnam. The Truman administration had secretly provided military aid to France during its colonial war against the Vietnamese independence movement, while publicly proclaiming neutrality. The Eisenhower administration had secretly undermined the 1954 Geneva Accords that were supposed to reunify Vietnam through elections, because U.S. intelligence assessed that Ho Chi Minh would win. The Kennedy administration had deepened covert military involvement while publicly minimizing it, and the Johnson administration had planned major escalation as early as 1964. Even as Johnson was campaigning for the presidency as the peace candidate, promising not to send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting. The study proved that the government knew the war was likely unwinnable. They knew it years before the worst escalation occurred. They sent tens of thousands of young Americans to die in a war their own internal assessments said couldn't be won because admitting failure was politically unacceptable. Ellsberg photocopied the entire study, all 7,000 pages, with the help of his Rand colleague, Anthony Russo, working nights at a commercial copy shop. He first tried to work within the system, approaching senators, congressmen, even Henry Kissinger. Nobody would touch it. Finally, in June 1971, Ellsberg leaked the papers to the New York Times. The first installment was published on June 13th. The Nixon administration immediately sought a court injunction to prevent further publication, the first time in American history that the federal government had attempted prior restraint of a newspaper. The case went to the Supreme Court in what became New York Times Company versus United States. The court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspaper's right to publish. Justice Hugo Black wrote, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, facing a possible 115 years in prison. But during the trial, it emerged that Nixon's operatives, the same plumbers unit that would later break into the Watergate complex, had burglarized the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in an attempt to find embarrassing material to discredit him. The judge dismissed all charges due to governmental misconduct. Ellsberg himself described the contents of the Pentagon papers as evidence of a quarter-century of aggression, broken treaties, deceptions, stolen elections, lies, and murder. He died in 2023 at the age of 92. He never regretted the leak. I felt that as an American citizen, as a responsible citizen, I could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public, he said. I did this clearly at my own jeopardy. The full Pentagon papers remained officially classified until June 2011, 40 years after the leak, when the government finally released all 7,000 pages to the public. The study that proved 4 presidents had lied about a war that killed over 3 million people took 4 decades to officially declassify. Between 1951 and 1957, the United States military conducted a series of exercises at the Nevada Proving Grounds that were, even by Cold War standards, extraordinary in their willingness to use American soldiers as experimental subjects. They were called the Desert Rock Exercises, and over the course of 8 separate events, approximately 50,000 American military personnel were deliberately exposed to the effects of nuclear weapons detonation. The premise was straightforward. The military needed to know whether soldiers could function on a nuclear battlefield. Could they advance toward ground zero after a blast? Could they maintain unit cohesion? Could they operate equipment? Could they fight? To answer these questions, the military did something that sounds like a fever dream. They positioned troops in trenches, in foxholes, in open formations, within proximity of nuclear detonations. Then they set off atomic bombs, and then they ordered the soldiers to advance toward the mushroom cloud. In Desert Rock 1 in 1951, approximately 1,000 soldiers, mostly from the 11th Airborne Division, watched a 21-kiloton nuclear bomb explode, and then advanced into the desert toward the blast site. This was their first taste of the atomic battlefield. By Desert Rock 5 in 1953, over 21,000 soldiers participated. This exercise featured the atomic cannon, a 280mm nuclear artillery piece that fired a 15-kiloton shell. Soldiers were positioned as close as 3,500 yards from ground zero. The largest exercises came in 1957 under Operation Plumbob. Over 16,000 service members participated in the biggest troop maneuvers in American nuclear testing history. And the radiation exposure was staggering. Operation Plumbob alone released approximately 58,300 kilocuries of radioiodine into the atmosphere, producing civilian radiation exposures estimated at 120 million person-rads of thyroid tissue exposure. That's 32% of all exposure from continental nuclear tests. Troops at the SHAD, designated Smoky, were exposed to especially high radiation levels. Many were not provided with adequate protective equipment. Some were given film badges to measure exposure, but the badges were often collected immediately after the exercise, and the results were not shared with the soldiers. The psychological component was just as calculated. Military researchers were conducting studies on the troops' emotional and psychological reactions to witnessing nuclear detonations. These weren't accidental byproducts of training. They were designed experiments with the soldiers as subjects. A 1980 survey of veterans who participated in the nuclear tests found significantly elevated rates of leukemia. A follow-up study in the 1990s confirmed that atomic veterans had a 50% higher leukemia death rate than unexposed veterans, along with elevated rates of nasal cancer and prostate cancer. For decades, the veterans' claims of radiation-related illness were dismissed. They were told their exposure had been minimal. They were told the tests were safe. Many were told that their health problems were unrelated to their service. It wasn't until 1990 that Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which finally offered payments to affected veterans. By then, many had already died. 50,000 men, ordered to march toward mushroom clouds by their own government, used as data points in experiments they never consented to, and then told for decades that nothing was wrong. If Desert Rock used soldiers as nuclear guinea pigs, Project SHAD used them as chemical and biological ones. SHAD, which stood for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, was a Department of Defense program that ran from 1962 to 1973. Its stated purpose was to determine the vulnerability of U.S. Navy ships to attack with chemical and biological weapons. Its actual method was to expose approximately 5,900 Navy and Marine Corps personnel to those very weapons without telling them. Test subjects, American sailors and Marines aboard U.S. Navy vessels, were exposed to sarin nerve gas, VX nerve gas, sulfur mustard, beta-staphylococcal enterotoxin, Bacillus glabigi, a simulant for anthrax, zinc cadmium sulfide, and the Q fever pathogen Coxiella burnetii. Some tests involved real biological warfare agents. Others used simulants that were themselves hazardous. The soldiers weren't warned. They weren't given protective equipment. They weren't told what had been done to them afterward. For decades, the Department of Defense denied that Project SHAD had ever existed. When veterans began reporting unusual health problems, respiratory issues, cancers, neurological disorders, and asking whether their symptoms might be connected to their service, they were turned away. Some reported being told by VA officials that they were imagining things. Others were, in the words of one veteran advocacy group, thrown out and told they were crazy. It wasn't until 1998 that the DoD acknowledged the program's existence, and it took until 2000 for the Pentagon to begin releasing test details to the affected veterans. By then, many of the test subjects had died. Many others had spent decades suffering from illnesses they couldn't explain, seeking treatment from a VA system that didn't acknowledge the cause of their conditions. The IOM, Institute of Medicine, conducted a review and concluded that long-term health effects from SHAD testing could not be ruled out. But the review was hampered by a fundamental problem. The DoD had destroyed many of the records. The complete roster of who was exposed to what, when, and at what dosage was incomplete at best. The pattern is familiar by now. The secret program, involuntary subjects, decades of denial, partial disclosure, and accountability that arrives too late for the people who needed it most. This one is different from the others. It wasn't classified. It wasn't hidden behind a code name. It happened in plain sight, reported in newspapers at the time. And then it was simply forgotten. During Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was illegal in the United States. But Americans kept drinking. The Treasury Department estimated that tens of millions of gallons of industrial alcohol were being stolen, redistilled, and sold for human consumption every year. In 1926, the government decided to do something about it. Not by increasing enforcement, not by cracking down on bootleggers. Instead, the Treasury Department, under President Calvin Coolidge's administration, ordered manufacturers to add lethal chemicals to industrial alcohol. The additives included methanol, wood alcohol, which causes blindness and death, at concentrations of up to 10% of the product. They also added pyridine base and benzene, both toxic. The intent was explicit. If people drank the stolen alcohol, they would get sick or die. And that, the government reasoned, would deter theft. A New York Times headline at the time read, "Government to double alcohol poison content." They doubled it. After the initial poisoning campaign wasn't producing enough deterrent effect, the government increased the methanol concentration. Christmas Eve, 1926. 60 people were hospitalized at New York's Bellevue Hospital with alcohol poisoning. 8 died before Christmas morning. The death toll climbed to 23 in the following days, with dozens more left permanently blind. In New York City alone in 1926, 1,200 people were sickened, and 400 died from poisoned alcohol. In 1927, deaths climbed to 700. Similar numbers were reported in cities across the country. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the best estimates suggest that at least 10,000 Americans had been killed by government-poisoned alcohol. Some researchers put the number significantly higher. New York City's chief medical examiner, Dr. Charles Norris, was one of the few officials who spoke publicly against the policy. His statement is worth hearing. The government knows it is not stopping drinking by putting poison in alcohol, yet it continues its poisoning processes, heedless of the fact that people determined to drink are daily absorbing that poison. The Anti-Saloon League, the most powerful temperance organization in the country, had a different view. Their leader, Wayne Wheeler, argued that the person who drinks this industrial alcohol is a deliberate suicide. In other words, if people die from poisoned alcohol, it's their own fault for drinking it. The policy disproportionately affected the poor. Wealthy Americans could afford imported liquor smuggled from Canada or the Caribbean, or they could patronize high-end speakeasies that sourced their alcohol from reliable bootleggers. The working class and the destitute drank whatever they could get, which was increasingly laced with government-mandated poison. The government knew people would die. They knew it from the beginning. And they continued the program for 7 years, through multiple administrations, even as the death toll mounted. Because deterrence was more important than lives. Because political ideology trumped public health. Because the people who were dying were poor, and the people who were making the decisions were not. It's one of the only items on this list that wasn't technically a secret. It was policy. Public, acknowledged, reported upon policy. And somehow that makes it worse. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Within a week, the Warren Commission was established to investigate. Within 10 months, it had concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. That was the official story. And for 62 years, the full documentary record behind that conclusion has remained partially classified. The story of the JFK files is less about what they reveal about the assassination itself. Most experts maintain that the core conclusion of Oswald as the gunman has not been overturned, and more about what they reveal about the institutional machinery of secrecy. In 1992, Congress passed the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, requiring the release of all assassination-related documents. The law set a final deadline of October 2017. That deadline was extended, then extended again, then extended again under Biden. Then in March 2025, President Trump ordered the release of approximately 80,000 pages. What those pages revealed wasn't a smoking gun about who killed Kennedy. It was a comprehensive portrait of what the CIA was doing around the world in the 1960s, and why they didn't want anyone to know. The documents showed that the CIA had manipulated elections in numerous foreign countries. They'd sabotaged economies, they'd plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, they'd overthrown governments, they'd spied on American journalists, they'd collaborated with the Mexican president on a massive telephone tapping operation, and they'd received secret assistance from more than a dozen allied governments: Canada, Britain, Israel, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile for espionage operations against Cuba. Perhaps the most significant revelation involved a CIA officer named George Joanides. Joanides had been the CIA's case officer for a Cuban exile group called the DRE, the Directorate for Revolutionary Students, which had a documented connection to Oswald in the weeks before the assassination. The DRE had publicly confronted Oswald in New Orleans in August 1963, creating a media incident that established Oswald's public profile as a pro-Castro activist. Despite this connection, the CIA assigned Joanides as its official liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, effectively putting the man who knew about the Oswald DRE connection in charge of deciding what information the investigators could see. This was not disclosed to the committee. When Joanides' full personnel file was finally released in 2025, Representative Anna Paulina Luna stated publicly, "We just learned definitively that the CIA has been lying for 62 years about the assassination of an American president." Whether or not those lies involve foreknowledge of the assassination is still debated. But what's not debated is that the CIA deliberately concealed relevant information from multiple investigations, placed a conflicted officer as gatekeeper to congressional investigators, and fought for 6 decades to keep documents classified that the law required them to release. A 2023 Gallup poll found that 65% of Americans reject the Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion. Whatever the truth about Dallas, the government's own behavior, the concealment, the delays, the institutional resistance to transparency, has done more to fuel suspicion than any conspiracy theory ever could. In 1977, journalist Carl Bernstein, one of the 2 reporters who broke the Watergate story, published a 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone magazine. Its subject was the CIA's relationship with the American press, and its conclusions were extraordinary. According to Bernstein's reporting, the CIA had cultivated relationships with over 400 American journalists who secretly carried out assignments for the agency. Reporters, editors, and executives from the New York Times, CBS, ABC, Time Magazine, and other major outlets were on the CIA payroll, or operating under formal agreements that made them, in effect, intelligence assets. The Church Committee's investigation in 1975 had already identified 50 journalists with official secret CIA relationships, but Bernstein's number was much larger, and the nature of the relationships was deeper than most people imagined. This wasn't just about planting favorable stories. The CIA maintained a network of what were described as several hundred foreign individuals who influenced international opinion through covert propaganda operations. These assets had access to numerous newspapers, news agencies, press services, radio stations, television networks, and book publishers around the world. The domestic propaganda operation employed approximately 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees during its peak in the 1950s. The annual cost to taxpayers was estimated at $265 million, much of it siphoned from the Marshall Plan, the massive American aid program that was rebuilding post-war Europe. The operation had roots going back to the late 1940s when Frank Wisner, the CIA's head of covert operations, established what he called his mighty Wurlitzer, a reference to the theater organs that could produce a full orchestral sound. Wisner's Wurlitzer was a propaganda network so vast that it could amplify any message the CIA wanted to project through seemingly independent media channels to audiences around the world. Now, the question of whether this constituted a formal program called Operation Mockingbird is actually debated by historians. The name appears in some declassified documents, but the scope and organizational structure attributed to Mockingbird varies depending on the source. What isn't debated is that the CIA had deep, systematic, decades-long relationships with American media organizations. Relationships that compromised the independence of the press at the exact moment when an independent press was needed most. In February 1976, newly appointed CIA Director George H.W. Bush announced that the agency would no longer enter into any paid or contract relationship with accredited journalists. However, and this is the caveat that matters, Bush added that the CIA would continue to welcome the voluntary cooperation of journalists. The distinction between paid collaboration and voluntary cooperation is, in practice, razor thin. The declassified CIA documents known as the Family Jewels, 702 pages released in June 2007, confirmed that intelligence-press relationships persisted well beyond Bush's supposed prohibition. Think about what this means for the information ecosystem of the Cold War era. The newspapers Americans read, the news broadcasts they watched, the magazines they subscribed to, the books they bought. An unknowable percentage of that content was shaped, placed, or directly produced by an intelligence agency operating in secret. The press was supposed to be the check on government power, the fourth estate, the watchdog, and the CIA turned it into a tool of government power without the public ever knowing. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed something that had been whispered about for decades but never officially acknowledged. Across Western Europe, from the late 1940s through at least the 1980s, the CIA and British MI6 had created, funded, trained, and armed secret armies in at least 14 NATO countries. The program was called Operation Gladio in Italy. Other countries used different names, but the structure was the same everywhere. Covert, stay-behind networks of military operatives, hidden weapons caches, and communication systems designed to function behind enemy lines in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The idea was defensive, at least in theory. If the Red Army rolled west, conventional NATO forces might be overwhelmed. The stay-behind networks would remain in occupied territory, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla warfare. It was a contingency plan for the worst-case scenario, but the worst-case scenario never arrived. The Soviets never invaded Western Europe, and the secret armies, with their weapons caches and their trained operatives and their absolute lack of democratic oversight, found other things to do. In Italy, the Gladio network became entangled with far-right extremist groups. Investigations by Italian magistrates, which continued through the 1990s and 2000s, uncovered evidence linking stay-behind operatives to a string of terrorist attacks known as the strategy of tension. The theory, supported by testimony and documentary evidence, was that right-wing violence was being used to create public fear and instability, which would in turn justify authoritarian crackdowns and prevent left-wing political parties from gaining power. The most devastating of these attacks was the Bologna railway station bombing of August 2, 1980, which killed 85 people and wounded over 200. Italian courts eventually convicted members of a neo-fascist group, and subsequent investigations revealed connections to Italian military intelligence and, through it, to the Gladio infrastructure. Now, the direct involvement of the CIA in specific terrorist acts has never been conclusively proven in court, but the existence of the networks and the lack of oversight created conditions in which such activities could occur, and the European Parliament, in a resolution passed on November the 22nd, 1990, formally condemned the existence of the clandestine networks and demanded full investigations by member states. Belgian investigators discovered that the stay-behind networks in their country were still active in 1990. In some countries, the networks had been operating for over 40 years without the knowledge of elected civilian governments. 14 countries, secret armies, hidden weapons, no democratic accountability for 4 decades, and in at least one country, credible evidence of connections to mass casualty terrorism. When Andreotti confirmed Gladio's existence, he said he'd only recently learned about it himself. Whether that was true or a convenient claim of ignorance? Well, that's the kind of question that Gladio makes impossible to answer with certainty. Because the entire point of the program was to make certain questions unanswerable. The story of American mass surveillance doesn't begin with Edward Snowden. It begins in 1945. The war was barely over when the Armed Forces Security Agency, the NSA's predecessor, approached the 3 major cable companies that handled international telegram traffic: Western Union, RCA Global, and ITT World Communications. The request was simple: provide copies of every international telegram entering or leaving the United States. The companies agreed. The program was called Shamrock, and it would run for 30 years, from 1945 to 1975, without a single warrant, without congressional authorization, and without the knowledge of the American public. Every international telegram, every day, for 3 decades. At its peak, NSA analysts were processing 150,000 messages per month, and within Shamrock, a sub-program called Minaret maintained watch lists of American citizens whose communications were of particular interest. The names on those lists included Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, Jane Fonda, and, in a detail that underscores the program's indiscriminate nature, sitting United States senators. When Senator Frank Church exposed Shamrock during his committee's investigation in 1975, he described it as probably the largest government interception program affecting Americans ever undertaken. He also issued a warning that would prove prophetic: the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. Shamrock was shut down after the Church Committee's revelations. New laws were passed. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a secret court to oversee intelligence surveillance. The system was supposed to prevent another Shamrock from happening. It didn't. In 1971, a global surveillance network called Echelon was established under the UQSA Agreement, a signals intelligence alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, known as the Five Eyes. Echelon was designed to intercept satellite communications on a planetary scale. Virtually every phone call, fax, and email that traveled via satellite was potentially captured and analyzed. The European Parliament conducted an investigation into Echelon in 2001 and concluded that the system was real, operational, and being used not only for national security purposes, but also for economic espionage, intercepting communications of European companies to give American firms competitive advantages. The United States government has never officially confirmed Echelon's existence. It has also never officially denied it. And then came 2013. On June 5th, 2013, the Guardian newspaper published a classified court order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court requiring Verizon to provide the NSA with metadata on all telephone calls, domestic and international, handled by the company. The source of the leak was a 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden. Over the following weeks and months, Snowden's disclosures revealed a surveillance apparatus that dwarfed anything Shamrock or Echelon had achieved. Programs with names like Prism, X-Keyscore, and Boundless Informant showed that the NSA was collecting approximately 1.7 billion communications every single day. The stated goal of the collection program, according to one internal NSA presentation, was chillingly simple: collect it all. Prism provided direct access to user data from major technology companies, including Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, and Yahoo. X-Keyscore allowed analysts to search through vast databases of emails, chats, browsing histories, and social media activity. Boundless Informant was a data visualization tool that showed the NSA precisely how much intelligence it was collecting from each country. The NSA was recording the phone calls of Allied heads of state, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel. It was collecting the cell phone location data of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It was tapping the fiber optic cables that carried the world's internet traffic. When the scope of the surveillance was revealed, the response was a strange mixture of outrage and resignation. Many people seemed less shocked that the government was doing it than that someone had actually proved it. Snowden fled to Hong Kong and then to Russia, where he was granted asylum. He was charged under the Espionage Act. He has maintained that his disclosures were in the public interest. "I don't want to live in a society that does these sort of things," he said. "I do not want to live in a world where everything I do and say is recorded." The arc from Shamrock to Snowden spans nearly 70 years, 3 times. After the Church Committee, after Echelon's exposure, after Snowden's revelations, the public learned that its government was conducting mass surveillance. 3 times reforms were promised. 3 times the surveillance continued in new forms, under new names, with new legal justifications. Senator Church's 1975 warning remains the most prescient statement in the history of American intelligence oversight. If this government ever became a tyranny, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back. He said that before the internet existed, before smartphones, before social media, before cloud computing, and the NSA's internal motto, "Collect it all." The tools Church warned about have only gotten more powerful. The oversight he fought to create has only gotten weaker. And the question he raised, whether a democracy can survive in the hands of an intelligence apparatus with the capacity for total information awareness, remains unanswered. In 1972, the Central Intelligence Agency funded something that sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel. They hired psychics, not as a joke, not as a one-time experiment, as a 23-year, $20 million intelligence program that operated continuously from 1972 to 1995, employed dozens of remote viewers, generated thousands of intelligence reports, and was taken seriously enough to survive multiple congressional reviews and bureaucratic reorganizations. The program went through several code names over its lifetime: Scanate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, before settling on Stargate in 1991. The basic concept never changed. Trained individuals would attempt to perceive information about distant or hidden targets using nothing but their minds. The theoretical framework was called remote viewing, a term coined by physicists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff at the Stanford Research Institute, where the earliest experiments were conducted. The protocol was simple. A remote viewer would be given a set of geographic coordinates or a sealed envelope containing a target identifier. They would then enter a relaxed state and attempt to describe what they saw at the target location. The results were mixed, but some of them were remarkable enough to keep the program funded for over 2 decades. In one frequently cited case, a remote viewer reportedly provided information that helped locate a downed Soviet Tu-22 bomber in Africa. In another, a viewer described the interior of a Soviet submarine facility before it was photographed by satellites. In a third, viewers provided descriptions of a hostage location that matched subsequent intelligence reports. The intelligence community's assessment of remote viewing was never enthusiastic, but it was never entirely dismissive either. A 1984 Army report concluded that the phenomenon was real but unreliable, too inconsistent for operational use, but genuine enough to merit continued study. The program was staffed at Fort Meade, Maryland, by a rotating cast of military personnel and civilian contractors. Some of the viewers were genuine believers in psychic phenomena. Others were pragmatists who'd been assigned to the unit and made the best of it. The work environment was, by most accounts, bizarre. A government office where people spent their days sitting in darkened rooms trying to perceive Soviet military installations through extrasensory perception. In 1995, the CIA commissioned an external review by the American Institutes for Research. The review, led by statistician Jessica Utz and psychologist Ray Hyman, reached a split conclusion. Utz argued that the statistical evidence for remote viewing was compelling. Hyman argued that while the results were interesting, they didn't meet the standards required for scientific proof. Both agreed on one thing. The phenomenon was too unreliable for operational intelligence use. The program was terminated. In 2017, the CIA declassified approximately 12 million pages of documents related to Stargate and its predecessor programs. The sheer volume of material, covering 2 decades of experiments, protocols, results, and internal debates, provides an extraordinary window into how the intelligence community grapples with phenomena that resist conventional explanation. Whether you believe remote viewing is real or an elaborate exercise in self-deception, the fact remains. The United States government spent 23 years and $20 million investigating psychic spying, and they didn't do it because they were credulous. They did it because the Soviets were doing it too, and the intelligence community couldn't afford to fall behind in any potential capability, even one that defied the laws of physics. The Cold War logic was relentless. If there's even a small chance the enemy has psychic spies, you need psychic spies too. And so for 23 years, in a nondescript office at Fort Meade, government employees tried to see through walls with their minds. Your tax dollars at work. Here's something most Americans don't realize. Every president from Franklin Roosevelt through Richard Nixon secretly recorded conversations in the White House. Not some conversations, not important meetings, virtually everything. The practice began with FDR in the early 1940s and continued through 6 administrations, producing over 30,000 unique recordings. Roosevelt recorded using a machine hidden in the basement. Truman continued the practice. Eisenhower recorded. Kennedy had a sophisticated system installed in the Oval Office and Cabinet Room. Johnson recorded obsessively, over 840 hours of telephone conversations alone. And then there was Nixon. On February 16th, 1971, a voice-activated recording system was installed in the Oval Office, the Executive Office, Building Office, the Cabinet Room, Camp David, and on multiple White House telephone lines. The system was triggered automatically by the sound of voices, meaning that everything said in those rooms was captured, whether the participants knew it or not. The existence of the system was known to only a handful of people: Nixon himself, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, Aide Alexander Butterfield, Aide Lawrence Higbee, and the Secret Service technicians who maintained the equipment. The irony is almost too perfect. Lyndon Johnson, Nixon's predecessor, had a recording system too. And when Nixon took office, Johnson actually told Nixon about his tapes. Johnson advised Nixon to keep recording, saying the tapes would be invaluable for his memoirs. Nixon initially ordered the system dismantled, then changed his mind and had a new, more sophisticated system installed. Over the next 2.5 years, Nixon's system recorded over 3,700 hours of conversations. Many of these recordings captured the most sensitive discussions of the Nixon presidency, including the discussions that would destroy it. The existence of the tapes became public on July 16, 1973, when Alexander Butterfield, one of the few people who knew about the system, revealed it during testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee. The revelation was a bombshell. If tapes existed, they could prove whether Nixon had participated in the Watergate cover-up. The battle over the tapes consumed the remainder of Nixon's presidency, and then there was the gap. On September 29, 1973, Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, was transcribing the tape from June 20, 1972, a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman recorded just 3 days after the Watergate break-in. Woods claimed she accidentally erased part of the recording while answering a phone call, hitting the record button instead of stop. She demonstrated the maneuver for investigators, stretching awkwardly across her desk in a posture that was immediately dubbed the Rosemary Stretch. She said the accident accounted for about 5 minutes of erasure. The actual gap was 18.5 minutes. Forensic analysis later determined that the gap had been produced by at least 5, and possibly as many as 9, separate erasure and re-recording events. This was not a single accidental button press. Somebody had deliberately erased 18.5 minutes of a conversation recorded 3 days after the most consequential burglary in American political history. We will never know what was on those 18.5 minutes. The gap remains one of the most enduring mysteries of American political history. The tapes that did survive, approximately 2,950 hours of the nearly 3,000 hours recorded, ultimately proved Nixon's participation in the Watergate cover-up and led directly to his resignation on August 9, 1974. The final batch of 340 hours was released on August 19, 2013. All told, it took 39 years for the full recordings to become publicly available. The lesson of the White House tapes is double-edged. On one hand, the recordings provided an unprecedented window into presidential decision-making, the raw, unfiltered reality of power in action. On the other hand, they demonstrated that the most powerful person in the world was comfortable conducting the nation's business under conditions of total surveillance, as long as he controlled the recordings. Nixon's system was voice-activated. He couldn't turn it off without dismantling it entirely, which means that for 2.5 years, the President of the United States was recording himself committing crimes. The paranoia that drove him to install the system was the same paranoia that made him refuse to destroy the tapes, when doing so might have saved his presidency. Power recording itself, and then being destroyed by the recordings. For decades, the United States government refused to acknowledge that Area 51 existed. Maps didn't show it. Officials didn't reference it. The restricted airspace above it was designated simply as part of the Nevada Test and Training Range, and its absence from the official record fueled one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in American culture: that the government was hiding evidence of extraterrestrial contact. In 2013, the CIA finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. Area 51 was real. It was located at Groom Lake in the Nevada desert, and it had been used since the 1950s as a testing ground for some of the most advanced aircraft in American history. The U-2 spy plane was tested there. The A-12 Oxcart, the CIA's Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft, was developed there. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter made its first flights there. These were genuine marvels of engineering, decades ahead of anything in the public domain. And here's where the UFO connection gets interesting. Not because of aliens, but because of deliberate government deception. Declassified CIA documents revealed that U-2 flights at 60,000 feet, far higher than any known aircraft of the 1950s, accounted for more than half of all UFO reports during that era. Airline pilots, military observers, and civilians on the ground saw objects moving at impossible altitudes and speeds. They reported them as unidentified flying objects, and the CIA let them. The agency deliberately allowed UFO rumors to persist because they provided perfect cover. Every genuine sighting of a classified aircraft that was reported as a UFO was a sighting that didn't get investigated as an espionage concern. The mythology served the secrecy. So the government didn't just fail to correct the record. They actively benefited from the public's belief in flying saucers. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the skeptics didn't expect. In December 2017, the New York Times published a front-page story revealing the existence of a previously unknown Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATEP. The program had been running since 2007 with a budget of $22 million, investigating reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. UAPs, the military's updated terminology for UFOs. The story's centerpiece was a 2004 encounter involving the USS Nimitz carrier strike group off the coast of Southern California. The encounter is now known as the Tic Tac incident, and it remains one of the most well-documented UAP cases in history. On November 14, 2004, the USS Princeton, an Aegis-class cruiser equipped with the most advanced radar systems in the U.S. Navy, had been tracking anomalous radar contacts for several days. The objects were descending from 80,000 feet to sea level in a matter of seconds. A performance envelope far beyond any known aircraft. Commander David Fravor, a veteran F/A-18 pilot with 18 years of experience, was vectored to investigate. What he saw was in his own words, unlike anything I had ever seen in my career. Fravor described an object roughly 40 feet long, white, smooth, with no visible wings, no visible propulsion system, and no exhaust plume. It was hovering erratically above a disturbance in the ocean. When Fravor descended to investigate, the object accelerated away at a speed that his instruments couldn't track. A second flight of fighters, equipped with an infrared camera system, recorded the FLIR video, which showed a heat-emitting object moving in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics. The video was released to the public in 2017 and was later officially confirmed as authentic by the Department of Defense. Lieutenant Commander Chad Underwood, who captured the video, described the object's behavior. Its changes in altitude, airspeed, and aspect were just unlike things that I've ever encountered before flying against other air targets. No investigation was conducted at the time. Commander Fravor told Congress that after the 2004 encounter, no one else talked to us. The encounter was simply dropped. In 2023, Fravor gave testimony under oath to the House Oversight Committee, stating that the technology that we faced was far superior than anything that we had. Now, I want to be careful here. None of this proves extraterrestrial origin. Skeptics, including analyst Mick West, have offered alternative explanations for the FLIR video. The encounter took place over a military training range, where unusual phenomena, including classified test programs, could plausibly account for some observations. But what is undeniable is this: the Pentagon spent decades lying about its interest in UAPs. It actively cultivated public ridicule of the subject while privately funding investigation programs. And when confronted with encounters involving trained military observers, advanced sensor systems, and physical evidence that defied conventional explanation, it buried the reports and told the pilots to keep quiet. The government that once used UFO rumors as cover for spy planes found itself decades later unable to explain what its own military was encountering. Whether the answer is foreign technology, classified programs, atmospheric phenomena, or something else entirely. The pattern of concealment is identical to every other chapter in this video. Deny, classify, ridicule those who ask questions, and hope nobody looks too closely. In June of 1970, President Richard Nixon approved a plan that, for 5 days, effectively suspended the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The plan was written by a 29-year-old White House aide named Tom Charles Huston. It was formally titled Domestic Intelligence Gathering Plan, Analysis, and Strategy, and it was presented to Nixon as a response to the anti-war movement, campus unrest, and what the administration perceived as a growing domestic security crisis. The Huston Plan authorized warrantless domestic burglary for intelligence purposes, warrantless electronic surveillance of American citizens, interception and reading of private mail, infiltration of domestic organizations through informants and provocateurs, expanded use of military intelligence units for domestic surveillance, and, most ominously, provisions for detention camps to hold anti-war protesters and political dissidents. Nixon signed the plan on July 14, 1970. For 5 days, from July 14th to July 19th, these activities were officially authorized by the President of the United States. Constitutional lawyers who have studied the plan believe that during those 5 days, the Bill of Rights was formally suspended, not by martial law, not by congressional action, but by a presidential signature on a classified document. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was, let's remember, already conducting many of these activities through COINTELPRO, objected to the plan. Not on moral grounds, not because he opposed domestic surveillance, but because the plan would have formalized and documented activities that Hoover preferred to conduct, deniably. If the Huston plan was approved and later discovered, there would be a paper trail leading back to official authorization. Hoover wanted to keep his operations off the books. Under pressure from Hoover, Nixon rescinded the plan on July 19th. The official authorization was withdrawn, but, and this is the critical but, elements of the plan were implemented anyway. The White House Plumbers Unit, which would later break into the Watergate complex and the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, was essentially an operational manifestation of the Huston Plan's principles. Warrantless surveillance continued, domestic burglary continued, political infiltration continued. The plan was rescinded on paper. The activities it authorized never stopped. When the Senate Watergate Committee and the Church Committee later investigated the Huston Plan, they were able to reconstruct its contents from surviving documents and testimony. The plan was described as one of the most sweeping proposals for domestic intelligence expansion in American history, and it was approved by a sitting president. Tom Charles Huston, the aide who wrote it, later expressed regret, but he also noted that the activities the plan proposed were already being conducted by the FBI and other agencies. The plan, he argued, was simply an attempt to coordinate and authorize what was already happening in the shadows. And that may be the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair. The Huston Plan wasn't proposing something new. It was proposing to legalize something old, to bring the shadow state into the light of official policy. When that proved too politically dangerous, the shadow state simply went back to operating in the dark. 5 days. That's how long the Bill of Rights was officially suspended, and the activities that suspension authorized? They continued for years afterward, regardless of the rescission. The paper trail comes and goes. The surveillance never stops. In January of 1975, a freshman senator from Idaho named Frank Church was appointed chairman of a new Senate Select Committee. Its mandate was straightforward: investigate intelligence activities by the federal government. What the Church Committee found over the next 2 years would reshape American democracy, or at least it was supposed to. The committee's investigation was triggered by a series of revelations that had been building throughout 1974. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh had published a front-page story in the New York Times alleging that the CIA had conducted a massive domestic intelligence operation against anti-war activists and other dissidents. The story landed like a bomb in a political landscape already devastated by Watergate. The committee was given broad authority and, crucially, subpoena power. Church assembled a staff of over 100 investigators and began systematically prying open the intelligence community's most closely guarded secrets. The numbers they uncovered were staggering. 500,000 domestic intelligence files at FBI headquarters, 26,000 names on secret detention lists, 130,000 pieces of first-class mail opened and photographed, 300,000 names indexed by the CIA in a program codenamed Chaos, 50,000 intelligence reports from the Army's domestic surveillance of American citizens. But the numbers were just the beginning. The substance was worse. The committee documented CIA assassination plots against at least 5 foreign leaders: Fidel Castro of Cuba, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam, and General René Schneider of Chile. The plots against Castro were almost comically elaborate: poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, a contaminated diving suit. But the others were deadly serious. Lumumba and Dim were both killed, though the committee's findings on direct CIA involvement in the actual killings were mixed. They exposed MKUltra, they exposed COINTELPRO, they exposed Project Shamrock and Project Minaret. They exposed the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. They documented the Huston Plan. They revealed that the IRS had been used as a political weapon, auditing individuals at the request of the White House. Church himself delivered one of the most prescient warnings in American political history. Speaking about the NSA's surveillance capabilities, he said, "That capability at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. There would be no place to hide." He continued, "I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America, and we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That is the abyss from which there is no return." The committee's work led directly to the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, the Permanent Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and Executive Order 12,333, which banned U.S.-sanctioned assassinations of foreign leaders. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that the system had self-corrected, that transparency had won, that oversight would prevent the abuses from recurring. It didn't last. Within a decade, Iran-Contra demonstrated that covert operations could circumvent congressional oversight entirely. Within 3 decades, the NSA's post-9/11 surveillance programs made Shamrock look quaint. Within 5 decades, the assassination ban had been reinterpreted to allow drone strikes that kill foreign leaders and American citizens alike. Frank Church lost his Senate seat in 1980, partly due to a campaign against him funded by conservative groups who viewed his investigation as having weakened American intelligence. He died of cancer in 1984 at the age of 59. The committee he chaired remains the most comprehensive investigation of intelligence abuses in American history, and the reforms it produced remain the high watermark of democratic oversight of the intelligence community, a mark that has been steadily eroding ever since. Project Sunshine, which we covered earlier, was just one piece of a much larger story. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government conducted thousands of secret radiation experiments on American citizens, many of whom had no idea what was being done to them. The full scope didn't become clear until 1994, when President Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. The committee's investigation uncovered over 4,000 separate experiments involving tens of thousands of subjects. Some of the most disturbing cases involved the direct injection of radioactive materials into hospital patients. At the University of Rochester, patients were injected with plutonium to study how the human body absorbed and distributed the element. The patients were not told what was being injected into them. One of the subjects, Abcade, was a 53-year-old African-American construction worker who was hospitalized after a car accident in 1945. While being treated for broken bones, he was secretly injected with plutonium. Bone and tooth samples were extracted without his knowledge. Cade eventually realized something was wrong and left the hospital against medical advice. He died 8 years later. At Vanderbilt University in the late 1940s, over 800 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks that actually contained radioactive iron. The study was designed to measure how quickly radioactive materials transferred from mother to fetus. At least 3 of the babies born to these women died of cancers that researchers later acknowledged could be linked to the exposure. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, 73 developmentally disabled children were fed radioactive oatmeal in experiments jointly conducted by Harvard University and the MIT Radiation Laboratory during the 1940s and 1950s. The children's parents were told their sons were joining a science club that would provide them with special dietary benefits. They were not told about the radiation. At the Oregon and Washington state prisons, inmates had their testicles irradiated to study the effects of radiation on male fertility. The prisoners were paid small amounts, a few $100s, but the consent forms did not accurately describe the risks or the purpose of the experiments. In Cincinnati, patients at the General Hospital, many of them poor, many of them black, many of them suffering from terminal cancers, were subjected to total body irradiation at doses far higher than therapeutic levels. The study was funded by the Department of Defense and was designed not to treat the patient's cancers, but to determine how much radiation a soldier could withstand on a nuclear battlefield. At least 8 patients died within weeks of the exposure. In total, the advisory committee identified experiments involving intentional environmental releases of radiation to study dispersal patterns, administration of radioactive substances to subjects without their knowledge, total body irradiation experiments funded by the military, injection of radioactive isotopes into hospitalized patients, feeding of radioactive materials to institutionalized children, irradiation of prisoners' reproductive organs. The committee's 1995 report was over 900 pages long. It concluded that many of the experiments were conducted in environments where meaningful informed consent was impossible. Prisons, institutions for the disabled, impoverished hospital wards. The subjects were chosen, in most cases, precisely because of their vulnerability. They were people who lacked the social power to question what was being done to them. President Clinton issued a public apology. Some compensation was provided to surviving subjects and families, but no government official or researcher was criminally prosecuted for any of the experiments. The pattern, by now, is so familiar it almost doesn't need stating. Vulnerable populations, secret experiments, decades of concealment, a presidential apology, no criminal accountability, and the quiet assumption that it's all in the past. Between 1953 and 1973, the United States government overthrew or attempted to overthrow at least 7 democratically elected or sovereign governments around the world. The operations were conducted by the CIA, authorized by the White House, and concealed from the American public for decades. The pattern was remarkably consistent. A foreign government would adopt policies that threatened American economic or strategic interests. The administration would frame the situation as a Cold War crisis, communist influence, Soviet expansion, threats to the free world. The CIA would then execute a covert operation to remove the offending government and replace it with one more amenable to American interests. Iran was first. In 1953, Operation Ajax overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran's oil industry, threatening British petroleum interests. The CIA used suitcases of cash to bribe newspaper editors, religious leaders, and street thugs. They funded a propaganda campaign portraying Mossadegh as a communist. They organized fake protests. When the first coup attempt failed, a CIA agent, acting against orders to abort, improvised a second attempt that succeeded through what amounted to a purchased mob. Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah was restored to power. Anglo-Iranian oil, renamed British Petroleum, got its fields back, and Iran was set on a path that would lead, 26 years later, to the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the seizure of the American embassy, an event the revolutionaries explicitly linked to the 1953 coup. The Eisenhower administration considered Ajax a triumph and immediately applied the template to Guatemala. In 1954, Operation PB Success overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz after he implemented land reforms that affected the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with deep connections to the Eisenhower administration. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Alan Dulles had both served on United Fruit's board. The operation used a combination of psychological warfare, a small paramilitary force trained in Honduras and Nicaragua, and radio propaganda broadcasts that convinced the Guatemalan military their country was being invaded by a much larger force than actually existed. Arbenz resigned. A military junta took power. Guatemala descended into a civil war that lasted 36 years and killed an estimated 200,000 people, the vast majority of them indigenous Mayan civilians killed by the military the U.S. had empowered. Oh, and a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara happened to be in Guatemala during the coup. He watched the American-backed overthrow of a democratic government and drew conclusions. When he and Fidel Castro later came to power in Cuba, they immediately purged the military to prevent a repeat of what they'd witnessed in Guatemala. When the CIA tried the PB Success playbook at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, it failed spectacularly. And then there was Chile. In 1970, Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist, became president of Chile. Nixon reportedly told CIA Director Richard Helms to make the economy scream. The CIA spent millions on destabilization, funding opposition media, supporting strikes, and cultivating military officers willing to stage a coup. On September 11th, 1973, a date that would acquire very different associations 3 decades later, the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, overthrew Allende in a violent coup. Allende died in the presidential palace. Pinochet established a military dictatorship that lasted 17 years, during which thousands of political opponents were killed, tortured, or disappeared. Declassified documents, released in waves from the 1990s through the 2010s, confirmed what had long been suspected. The CIA was deeply involved in creating the conditions for the coup and in supporting the military officers who carried it out. 3 democracies, 3 coups, millions of lives reshaped. And in each case, the justification was the same. American strategic and economic interests required it. The people of Iran, Guatemala, and Chile didn't get a vote in whether their governments should be overthrown. That decision was made in Washington, behind closed doors, by men who would never face the consequences of their choices. In 1983, historian Athan Theoharis filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the FBI files on Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, humanitarian icon, and chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. What he received was 3,000 pages of surveillance records. 3,000 pages. On a former First Lady. The file documented decades of FBI monitoring of Roosevelt's activities, associations, and correspondence. Hoover suspected her of harboring communist sympathies, a suspicion based largely on her advocacy for civil rights, labor rights, and social justice. In Hoover's taxonomy, concern for the marginalized was evidence of ideological subversion. But Roosevelt was far from alone. The FBI maintained surveillance files on a staggering number of prominent Americans. The scope of the Bureau's curiosity was virtually unlimited. Albert Einstein's file ran to 1,427 pages. The FBI monitored Einstein from 1933 until his death in 1955, convinced that the man who revolutionized physics was a security risk because of his socialist political views and his advocacy for nuclear disarmament. Hoover personally authorized wiretaps on Einstein's telephone and the interception of his mail. John Lennon's file, released after years of legal battles, documented the FBI's surveillance of the former Beatle during his anti-Vietnam War activism in the early 1970s. The Nixon administration considered deporting Lennon as a political undesirable. FBI agents attended his concerts and monitored his public statements. Charlie Chaplin was driven from the United States entirely. After decades of FBI surveillance, Chaplin's file ran to nearly 2,000 pages. The Bureau compiled enough derogatory information to convince the Immigration and Naturalization Service to revoke Chaplin's re-entry permit while he was traveling abroad in 1952. Chaplin, one of the most famous entertainers in the world, never returned to the United States to live. Marilyn Monroe had an FBI file. Muhammad Ali had an FBI file. Ernest Hemingway had an FBI file, and Hemingway's persistent claims that he was being followed by the FBI, which his friends dismissed as paranoia, turned out to be entirely accurate. His file was released after his death and confirmed years of surveillance. By 1960, the FBI had accumulated files on over 432,000 individuals and organizations. Many of these files were maintained without any evidence of criminal activity. They were intelligence dossiers, collections of information about Americans whose views, associations, or prominence made them of interest to the Bureau. The celebrity files illustrate something important about the surveillance state. It doesn't just target enemies. It targets anyone who attracts attention, anyone who speaks out, anyone who organizes, anyone who dissents. The machine doesn't distinguish between genuine threats and inconvenient voices. It collects on everyone and sorts later, if it sorts at all. Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin, John Lennon. These weren't criminals. These weren't security threats. They were Americans who used their platforms to advocate for change. And for that, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country tracked their movements, read their mail, tapped their phones, and compiled dossiers that could be used against them if the political winds shifted. That's not law enforcement. That's political surveillance. And it operated continuously across administrations for decades. In the 1970s, the military dictatorships of South America faced a common problem. Political dissidents, leftists, labor organizers, student activists, journalists were fleeing their home countries to seek refuge in neighboring nations. Argentina's dissidents fled to Chile. Chile's fled to Brazil. Brazil's fled to Uruguay. The borders of South America had become escape routes, and the dictators found this inconvenient. The solution was unprecedented in its scope and its brutality. 6 South American military governments, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, formed a covert intelligence sharing and assassination network. Its purpose was to track, kidnap, torture, and kill political opponents across international borders. The program was called Operation Condor, and the United States government knew about it from the beginning. Declassified documents, released in waves during the 1990s and 2000s through the Clinton administration's Chile Declassification Project and subsequent FOIA requests, reveal that the CIA and the State Department were not merely aware of Condor. They helped facilitate it. The program was formally established in November 1975 at a meeting in Santiago, Chile, hosted by General Augusto Pinochet's intelligence service, the DINA, but the groundwork had been laid years earlier through CIA training programs, intelligence sharing agreements, and the cultivation of relationships with military and intelligence officers across the continent. The scale of Condor's operations was staggering. Across the 6 participating countries, an estimated 60,000 people were killed. 30,000 were disappeared, taken from their homes, their workplaces, or off the streets and never seen again. 400,000 were imprisoned. In Argentina alone, during the so-called Dirty War from 1976 to 1983, an estimated 30,000 people were disappeared by the military junta. Many were taken to secret detention centers where they were tortured for weeks or months. When the military was finished with them, many were drugged, loaded onto aircraft, and dropped alive into the Atlantic Ocean. These were called death flights. Condor's reach extended beyond South America. In September 1976, a car bomb in Washington, D.C. killed former Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier and his American colleague, Ronnie Moffett. The assassination was carried out by DINA agents operating on American soil, the first known state-sponsored assassination in the U.S. Capitol. Declassified documents later showed that the CIA had advance intelligence suggesting an operation against Letelier, but failed to prevent it. The most damning declassified document is a 1978 cable from Robert White, the U.S. ambassador to Paraguay, who reported to Washington that the South American intelligence services had established an assassination capability. White later testified that the State Department knew about Condor early on, and that U.S. intelligence agencies had actively participated in the formation of the network. Henry Kissinger, who served as Secretary of State during the critical period of Condor's formation, has been the subject of particular scrutiny. Declassified cables show that in June 1976, Kissinger directed the U.S. ambassador to Chile to inform Pinochet that human rights concerns should not be raised in a way that upsets them. Shortly after this instruction, the pace of disappearances in Chile and Argentina accelerated dramatically. When Argentine Admiral Cesar Guzzetti met with Kissinger in October 1976, Guzzetti reported back to Buenos Aires that Kissinger had given him green light to continue the military's campaign, A State Department official's memorandum of the conversation noted that Kissinger had told Gazzetti, "We wish the Argentine government well." The death flights continued. The full extent of U.S. involvement in Condor remains a subject of ongoing declassification. But what the existing documents reveal is clear enough. The United States provided training, intelligence, and diplomatic cover to a network of military dictatorships that collectively murdered, disappeared, and tortured hundreds of thousands of people across an entire continent. And the people who made the decisions, the policymakers, the intelligence officers, the diplomats who sent the cables and wrote the memoranda, retired to comfortable lives in Washington. Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize. The generals, when they eventually fell from power, were prosecuted by their own countries. The Americans who enabled them were not. In 1943, the U.S. government selected a remote stretch of desert in southeastern Washington state for a project so secret that even the workers building it didn't know what they were constructing. The site was called Hanford, and it would become the most contaminated nuclear facility in the Western Hemisphere. Hanford was one of the three main facilities of the Manhattan Project. Its primary purpose was the production of plutonium, the fissile material used in the Fat Man atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, on August 9th, 1945. Over the following decades, Hanford's 9 nuclear reactors produced approximately 2/3 of the nation's plutonium stockpile. The production process generated enormous quantities of radioactive waste, and the disposal methods were, well, by today's standards, they were catastrophically inadequate. Liquid waste, highly radioactive, was stored in underground tanks. Solid waste was buried in unlined trenches. Gaseous emissions were vented directly into the atmosphere, but the most disturbing aspect of Hanford's history isn't the waste disposal. It's what the government deliberately released on purpose. In December 1949, the military conducted an experiment called the Green Run. Without any public notice, Hanford released approximately 8,000 curies of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere to study the dispersal patterns of radioactive material from a plutonium production facility. For context, the 1979 Three Mile Island nuclear accident released approximately 15 curies. The Green Run released 500 times that amount, deliberately. The radioactive plume drifted over populated areas of eastern Washington and into Oregon. Residents, farmers, ranchers, families were not warned. They continued to drink milk from cows that had grazed on contaminated pasture, eat vegetables from contaminated gardens, and breathe contaminated air. The Green Run wasn't discovered by the public until 1986, when investigative journalists obtained declassified documents through FOIA requests. What they found triggered a broader investigation that revealed decades of environmental contamination. Between 1944 and 1972, Hanford released an estimated 740,000 curies of radioactive iodine, 131 into the air. The cumulative exposure affected an estimated 270,000 people in surrounding communities. Thyroid disease, cancer, and other radiation-related illnesses were reported at elevated rates among the downwinders, residents who lived in the path of Hanford's emissions. A study commissioned by the Centers for Disease Control, known as the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study, examined the health effects on over 3,400 people born between 1940 and 1946 who had been exposed to Hanford's emissions as children. The study's findings were contested. The CDC concluded that the evidence for a direct causal link was insufficient. while independent researchers and community advocates argued the study was designed to minimize findings. The legal battles continued for decades. In 2015, a federal court awarded over $60 million to plaintiffs who had been exposed to Hanford's emissions. But for many of the downwinders, the compensation came too late. They had already lived their entire lives with the health consequences of exposure they'd never been told about. And then there's the cleanup, or rather, the lack thereof. Hanford contains an estimated 53 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste stored in 177 underground tanks, many of which were designed for a 20-year lifespan and are now over 70 years old. At least 67 of these tanks have leaked, releasing an estimated 1 million gallons of radioactive liquid into the soil. The groundwater beneath Hanford is contaminated with radioactive and chemical waste. The contamination plume, 80 square miles of polluted groundwater, is migrating toward the Columbia River, the largest river in the Pacific Northwest and a critical source of drinking water, irrigation, and salmon habitat. The cleanup of Hanford has been ongoing since 1989 and is estimated to cost over $670 billion. It is the largest and most expensive environmental cleanup project in the world, and it's not expected to be completed until at least 2070, assuming the funding holds. Meanwhile, the tanks continue to leak. The contamination continues to spread. And the people who lived downwind of Hanford, who were never told that their government was releasing radiation into their air, their water, their food, continue to grapple with health problems that were classified for decades. Between 1960 and 1965, the Central Intelligence Agency attempted to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro at least 8 times. And that's the conservative estimate from the Church Committee's investigation. Cuban intelligence services have claimed the number is closer to 638 attempts spanning decades. Now, I should note, the number 638 comes from a Cuban government documentary and has not been independently verified. The Church Committee documented 8 specific plots. But even the verified attempts are so bizarre, so elaborately creative, that they read less like intelligence operations and less like geopolitical strategy and more like the fever dreams of a screenwriter who'd had too much coffee. The plots included a box of Castro's favorite cigars, laced with a botulinum toxin, so potent that merely placing one in the mouth would cause death. The CIA's Technical Services Division prepared the cigars and passed them to an agent for delivery. The cigars were never used. It's unclear whether the delivery mechanism failed or the operation was called off. An exploding seashell. The CIA planned to plant a booby-trapped conch shell in an area where Castro was known to go skin diving. The shell would be painted in bright, attractive colors to catch his attention and would detonate when he picked it up. The plan was abandoned as impractical. A contaminated diving suit. When American lawyer James Donovan was negotiating with Castro for the release of Bay of Pigs prisoners, the CIA prepared a wetsuit dusted with a fungus that would cause a chronic, debilitating skin disease and contaminated the breathing apparatus with tuberculosis bacteria. Donovan, unaware of the plan, brought his own gift wetsuit for Castro instead. The contaminated suit was never delivered. A ballpoint pen rigged with a hypodermic needle so fine that Castro wouldn't feel the injection. The pen would deliver a lethal dose of poison during a handshake or a casual encounter. The pen was prepared and delivered to a Cuban agent, but was never used. Thallium salt in his shoes. The CIA planned to dust Castro's shoes with thallium salts, which would cause his iconic beard to fall out. The theory being that without his beard, Castro would lose his charismatic appeal, and his political authority would collapse. This plan was, mercifully, never executed. And then there were the mafia plots. In what remains one of the most surreal chapters in CIA history, the agency contracted with American organized crime figures to assassinate Castro. The logic was that the mafia had its own grievances against Castro. He'd shut down their profitable casinos in Havana, and they had networks in Cuba that the CIA didn't. The CIA's intermediary was a former FBI agent named Robert Maheu. Maheu recruited two mafia figures, Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit, and Santos Traficante Jr., the mob boss who had operated casinos in pre-revolutionary Cuba. Through these contacts, the CIA provided poison pills that were to be slipped into Castro's food or drink by someone with access to his inner circle. The pills were delivered. Multiple attempts were made. Castro survived every single one. The Church Committee's investigation of the assassination plots produced some of the most revealing testimony in the history of congressional hearings. CIA officials described the plots in matter-of-fact bureaucratic language, as if poisoning a foreign leader's cigars were simply another line item in an operational budget. The disconnect between the gravity of what was being discussed and the tone in which it was discussed was, by multiple accounts, genuinely unsettling to the senators on the committee. When asked whether the CIA had considered the consequences of a successful assassination, one official replied that those considerations had been handled at a higher level. When asked who at that higher level had authorized the plots, the answers were evasive, contradictory, and ultimately inconclusive. The Church Committee concluded that while the CIA had clearly attempted to kill Castro, the chain of authorization was deliberately obscured. The concept of plausible deniability, the ability for senior officials to deny knowledge of covert operations, had been so thoroughly embedded in the system that it was impossible to determine with certainty who had given the orders. The assassination plots were among the key findings that led to Executive Order 12,333, signed by President Ford in 1976, which prohibited U.S. government employees from engaging in or conspiring to engage in assassination. Castro survived every attempt. He outlived 10 American presidents. He died in 2016 at the age of 90 of natural causes. The CIA's most elaborate, expensive, and creative assassination program in history failed completely, repeatedly, for decades, and the target died in his own bed. On June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the USS Liberty, a United States Navy technical research ship, was sailing in international waters in the Mediterranean Sea, approximately 14 nautical miles off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula. The Liberty was a signals intelligence vessel, essentially a floating listening post, bristling with antennas and electronic surveillance equipment. Its mission was to monitor the conflict and collect communications intelligence. The ship flew a large American flag. Its hull markings clearly identified it as a U.S. Navy vessel. It was broad daylight, clear weather, calm seas. At approximately 2 p.m. local time, Israeli fighter jets attacked the Liberty. The air attack lasted approximately 25 minutes and included strafing runs with cannon fire and rocket attacks. Israeli aircraft also dropped napalm on the ship's deck. Following the air assault, 3 Israeli torpedo boats approached the Liberty and launched torpedoes. One torpedo struck the ship on the starboard side, blowing a 39-foot hole in the hull and killing 25 crew members instantly. In total, 34 American crew members were killed, and 171 were wounded. The Liberty, a lightly armed intelligence vessel that posed no military threat to anyone, was left a burning, listing wreck. Israel claimed the attack was a case of mistaken identity. They said they had confused the Liberty with an Egyptian horse transport vessel, the El Qusair. The Israeli government apologized, called it a tragic accident, and eventually paid reparations. Approximately $6 million for the families of the dead and $3 million for the wounded. The United States government accepted this explanation. A Navy court of inquiry, conducted in just 1 week, concluded that the attack had been a case of mistaken identity. No American officers or officials challenged the finding publicly. President Johnson reportedly told his advisors that he would not embarrass our allies over the incident. Case closed, except the survivors didn't believe it, and they said so loudly for decades. The crew of the USS Liberty maintained, consistently under oath, in public testimony and private interviews over more than 50 years, that the attack was deliberate. Their arguments were detailed and specific. First, the weather was clear, and visibility was excellent. The American flag was clearly visible. Multiple crew members reported that Israeli reconnaissance aircraft had circled the Liberty at low altitude, close enough to be clearly identified, on multiple occasions in the hours before the attack. The ship had been positively identified. Second, the El Qusair, the ship Israel claimed to have confused with the Liberty, was less than half the Liberty's size, of completely different design, and had been out of service for years at the time of the attack. Third, the attack lasted over 2 hours, involved multiple waves of aircraft and torpedo boats, and was conducted with a level of coordination and persistence that seemed inconsistent with an accident. During the torpedo boat attack, crew members reported that the boats targeted the Liberty's communication antennas, suggesting an intent to prevent the ship from sending distress signals. Fourth, intercepted communications, which have been referenced by former NSA analysts but remain classified, allegedly contain Israeli communications indicating awareness that the target was an American vessel. In 2003, an independent commission led by Admiral Thomas Moorer, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, concluded that the attack was a deliberate attempt to sink an American ship and murder its entire crew. The commission's findings were never acknowledged by the U.S. government. In 2007, declassified NSA documents revealed that the agency had intercepted Israeli communications related to the attack, but the contents of those intercepts remain classified to this day. Former NSA analysts who have spoken publicly about the intercepts have done so carefully, citing classification restrictions, but their implications have been consistent with the crew's account. Why would Israel attack an American ship? The most commonly cited theory is that the Liberty's electronic surveillance had intercepted communications revealing Israeli military operations that the Israelis didn't want documented. potentially including the execution of Egyptian prisoners of war in the Sinai, which was later confirmed by Israeli historians. Why would the United States cover it up? Because in 1967, the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship was deepening rapidly, and the Johnson administration, already consumed by Vietnam, had no appetite for a crisis with a key ally. The surviving crew members of the USS Liberty spent decades fighting for a congressional investigation. They never got one. The classified NASA intercepts have never been released. And the official U.S. position that the attack was a tragic mistake has never been revised. 34 American sailors were killed by a close Allies' military forces. The survivors said it was deliberate. Multiple senior military officials agreed. The evidence was classified, and the government chose its alliance over its own sailors. That's the story of the USS Liberty, the attack that America tried to forget. In the summer of 1933, a retired Marine Corps Major General named Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, was approached by a group of wealthy businessmen with an extraordinary proposition. They wanted him to lead an army of 500,000 veterans in a march on Washington to overthrow President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Butler was an unusual choice for a coup leader, and that, paradoxically, is why they chose him. He was enormously popular with veterans. He was known for his blunt, populist speaking style, and he had recently given speeches critical of American military adventurism abroad, which the plotters interpreted as indicating he might be sympathetic to their cause. The plotters, according to Butler's testimony, were representatives of some of the most powerful financial and industrial interests in the United States. Their complaint was straightforward. Roosevelt's New Deal was threatening their wealth. The Securities and Exchange Commission was regulating Wall Street. The Banking Act was restructuring the financial system. And the plotters saw in these reforms not democratic governance, but creeping socialism. Their plan, as Butler described it to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, a special congressional committee investigating un-American activities, was modeled on the recent fascist movements in Europe. They wanted to install a Secretary of General Affairs who would effectively run the government while Roosevelt remained as a figurehead. The model they explicitly cited was the March on Rome that had brought Mussolini to power in Italy. Butler played along initially, gathering information about the plot's organizers and financial backers. Then he went to Congress. His testimony before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee in November 1934 was detailed and specific. He named names. He described meetings. He provided a chronology of the recruitment effort. The committee's investigation confirmed key elements of Butler's account. Their final report stated, "In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution if the combative and patriotic General Butler had not exposed the plot." And then, nothing happened. No prosecutions, no arrests, no criminal investigation. The individuals named by Butler, representatives of some of the wealthiest families and most powerful corporations in America, were never charged with any crime. The mainstream press largely ridiculed the story. The New York Times called Butler's claims a gigantic hoax. Time magazine dismissed them as fantasy. The narrative that a Wall Street-backed fascist coup had been attempted against an American president was simply too inconvenient to take seriously. Now, historians have debated the scope and seriousness of the business plot for nearly a century. Some argue that Butler exaggerated or misunderstood what was essentially a fundraising pitch from disgruntled businessmen. Others point to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee's own findings, which confirmed the plot's existence. What is not debated is that Smedley Butler testified under oath that powerful American business interests had attempted to recruit him for a fascist coup against the elected government of the United States. And that testimony was corroborated by the congressional committee that investigated it. Butler himself, in his later years, wrote a short book called War is a Racket, in which he argued that military force was routinely used to protect corporate interests rather than national security. I spent 33 years in active military service, he wrote, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. Coming from one of the most decorated Marines in American history, a man who had been asked to lead a coup and refused, those words carry a particular weight. The business plot of 1933 is one of the least known chapters in American political history. A fascist coup, backed by Wall Street, aimed at overthrowing a democratically elected president. Confirmed by Congress, reported to the public, and then quietly buried under ridicule and indifference. Because some secrets don't need to be classified, they just need to be ignored. In 1987, during the Iran-Contra hearings, something extraordinary happened on live television. Representative Jack Brooks of Texas asked Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North a question about a secret government plan, a plan that would authorize the suspension of the Constitution and the detention of large numbers of American citizens. Before North could answer, committee chairman Senator Daniel Inouye cut Brooks off. "I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area," Inouye said. "May I request that you not touch upon that, sir?" Brooks protested. "I read it in several newspapers," he said. "I wanted to get the man's confirmation." Inouye shut him down. The question was never answered in open session. The hearing moved on. The plan Brooks was asking about was called Rex 84, and its existence was not a rumor. Rex 84, short for Readiness Exercise 1984, was a classified contingency plan developed by Oliver North and officials at the Federal Emergency Management Agency under the Reagan administration. Its stated purpose was to prepare the federal government for a scenario involving mass civil unrest, mass immigration, or a major national emergency that would overwhelm normal government operations. The plan's provisions were, by any measure, extraordinary, according to reporting by the Miami Herald's Alfonso Chardi, who broke the story in July 1987. Rex 84 authorized the suspension of the Constitution, the declaration of martial law, the placement of military commanders in charge of state and local governments, the detention of large numbers of American citizens in internment facilities. The plan identified specific groups who might be targeted for detention: political dissidents, undocumented immigrants, and, during the Reagan-era's Cold War paranoia, anyone deemed a national security threat by executive determination. The camps to be used included decommissioned military bases that FEMA had been quietly preparing as potential detention sites. Now, to understand how Rex 84 came into being, you need to understand the deeper history of what the government calls continuity of government planning, COG. Since the early Cold War, the federal government has maintained classified plans for preserving governmental authority in the event of a nuclear attack or other catastrophic event. These plans involved secret bunkers, shadow government structures, and pre-delegated authorities that could bypass normal constitutional processes. By the 1980s, COG planning had expanded well beyond its original nuclear war scenario. Under Reagan, a small group of officials, including North, who worked on the National Security Council, and FEMA Director Louis Giuffrida, began developing plans that applied COG concepts to domestic scenarios, civil unrest, mass protests, and political crises. Giuffrida himself had written a master's thesis at the Army War College in 1970 that proposed the detention of all American Negroes in internment camps in the event of urban racial unrest. This was not a fringe figure. This was the man Reagan appointed to lead FEMA. Under Giuffrida's leadership, FEMA conducted a series of exercises, including Rex 84, that rehearsed the logistics of mass detention and martial law. The exercises involved coordination between FEMA, the Department of Defense, and other federal agencies. They tested communication systems, command structures, and the physical infrastructure needed to hold large numbers of detainees. When the Iran-Contra scandal broke, investigators discovered that North's secret network, the same one funneling arms to Iran and money to the Contras, had also been involved in Rex 84 planning. North's office had been a nexus for multiple classified programs, and Rex 84 was intertwined with the broader web of covert operations that defined the Reagan national security apparatus. The Miami Herald's reporting confirmed the basic outline of the plan. Congressional investigators, including Brooks, sought further details, but the classified nature of the program meant that most of its specifics remained hidden from public view. What is known is this: the federal government of the United States developed and rehearsed a detailed plan for suspending the Constitution, imposing martial law, and detaining American citizens in camps. The plan was not theoretical. It was exercised. Infrastructure was prepared. Command structures were established. And when a congressman asked about it on live television, he was told to stop asking. In the years after Iran-Contra, continuity of government planning continued, growing more expansive, not less. After September 11th, 2001, COG plans were activated for the first time in American history. Vice President Dick Cheney was moved to an undisclosed location. Shadow government operations were initiated, and the specific provisions of those post-9/11 COG plans remain classified to this day. Peter DeFazio, a Democratic congressman from Oregon who served on the Homeland Security Committee, requested access to the classified COG annexes in 2007. His request was denied. A sitting member of the committee, responsible for overseeing Homeland Security, was told he could not see the government's plans for what happens when the Constitution is suspended. Maybe the people who think there's a conspiracy out there are right, DeFazio said publicly after being denied access. Rex 84 was supposed to be a contingency plan, a just-in-case scenario, an exercise in preparedness for an emergency that might never come. But the infrastructure it created didn't disappear when the exercise ended, the plans didn't stop being updated. And the question that Jack Brooks tried to ask on live television in 1987 has never been fully answered. What, exactly, is the government prepared to do to its own citizens in an emergency? What authorities have been pre-delegated? What infrastructure has been prepared? Who decides when the Constitution can be set aside? Those answers are classified, and if the history of every other chapter in this video is any guide, we'll find out what they are in about 30 to 50 years. On the evening of May 13th, 1985, in the Cobbs Creek neighborhood of West Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on its own residents. Not a metaphorical bomb, not a political bomb, a literal explosive device, assembled from C4 military-grade plastic explosive and Tovex, dropped from a Pennsylvania State Police helicopter onto the roof of a residential row house at 62210 Osage Avenue. The resulting fire was allowed to burn. 11 people were killed, including 5 children. 61 homes were destroyed. An entire city block was reduced to rubble and ash. And no government official was ever criminally charged. The target was MOVE, a Black Liberation and Back to Nature organization founded in the early 1970s by John Africa, born Vincent Lee Part. MOVE's members adopted the surname Africa, lived communally, advocated for animal rights and against technology, and had an increasingly confrontational relationship with their neighbors and with the Philadelphia police. The confrontations had a history. In 1978, a previous standoff at MOVE's headquarters in the Powelton Village neighborhood resulted in a shootout that killed 1 police officer and injured several firefighters and MOVE members. 9 MOVE members were convicted of third-degree murder for the officer's death and sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison, a sentence that many legal scholars have described as disproportionate and legally dubious, given that no individual was identified as having fired the fatal shot. By the early 1980s, MOVE had relocated to Osage Avenue in West Philadelphia. Neighbors complained about trash, about amplified political speeches broadcast at all hours, about unsanitary conditions. The city obtained arrest warrants for 4 MOVE members on various charges. On May 13, 1985, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Grigor Sambor approved a tactical plan to serve those warrants. The plan was, from the beginning, wildly disproportionate to its stated objective. At 5:35 a.m., police evacuated neighboring homes and issued a bullhorn announcement ordering MOVE members to come out. When they did not comply, police began a massive assault. Officers fired over 10,000 rounds of ammunition into the row house. They used tear gas. They used water cannons, high-pressure deluge guns mounted on cranes that poured thousands of gallons of water into the building. MOVE members, including children, were inside. They did not come out. After hours of the siege producing no resolution, Police Commissioner Sambor authorized what he later called an entry device to be dropped on the roof. The device was a satchel bomb containing approximately 4 pounds of C4 and Tovex explosive. Lieutenant Frank Powell of the Philadelphia Police Bomb Disposal Unit assembled the device. It was dropped from the helicopter at 5:28 p.m. The bomb detonated on the roof. It ignited a fire, fueled in part by a gasoline generator and fuel that MOVE had stored on the roof. The fire spread rapidly across the attached row houses, and then came the decision that transformed a police operation into a catastrophe. Fire Commissioner William Richmond, on the scene, made the decision to let the fire burn. His later testimony indicated he believed, or was told, that the fire would be used tactically to force MOVE members out of the bunker they'd constructed on the roof. Mayor Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first black mayor, was informed of the fire but did not order it extinguished. The fire burned and burned and spread. Within an hour, the entire block of Osage Avenue was engulfed. The row houses, wooden-framed, densely packed, connected by shared walls, went up like kindling. Inside 6221 Osage Avenue, 11 people died. The dead included John Africa, 5 other adults, and 5 children: Katricia, Netta, Little Phil, Tommaso, and Tree Africa. The youngest was 6 years old. 2 people survived: Ramona Africa, an adult member who escaped through the rear of the burning building, and Birdie Africa, a 13-year-old boy. Ramona Africa suffered severe burns over much of her body. She was subsequently convicted of riot and conspiracy and served 7 years in prison. The 13-year-old survivor, the child who escaped a burning building after his government dropped a bomb on his home, received no criminal charges. He died in 2013 at the age of 41. The aftermath was devastating in every direction. 61 homes destroyed. 250 people left permanently homeless. An entire neighborhood incinerated because the city of Philadelphia decided to drop a bomb on a residential block and then let the fire burn. The investigations that followed were extensive, but ultimately toothless. A special commission appointed by Mayor Goode, the MOVE Commission, concluded that the decision to drop the bomb was unconscionable and that the decision to let the fire burn was grossly negligent. The commission held the mayor, the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, and the managing director responsible. The grand jury that investigated the bombing declined to issue any criminal indictments. No police officer, no city official, no political leader was ever criminally charged for the deaths of 11 people, including 5 children. Gregor Sambo resigned as police commissioner. William Richmond resigned as fire commissioner. Mayor Goode served out his term and lost his bid for re-election. The city of Philadelphia eventually paid $1.5 million in a civil settlement to Ramona Africa and the survivors, and in 2021, 36 years after the bombing, it was revealed that the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University had been holding the remains of 2 of the children killed in the MOVE bombing. The children's bones had been used as teaching specimens in anthropology courses. Their remains had been passed between institutions, studied, catalogued, and displayed, without the knowledge or consent of their surviving family members. The bones of children killed by their own government's bomb were being used as classroom props in Ivy League universities. When this was discovered, it provoked national outrage. The universities issued apologies. The remains were eventually returned to the family. But the revelation added another layer of institutional dehumanization to a story already defined by it. The MOVE bombing stands as one of the most extreme uses of force by an American government against its own citizens in the 20th century. A residential neighborhood. A bomb dropped from a helicopter. A fire deliberately allowed to burn. 11 dead, including 5 children. No criminal accountability. It happened in 1985, not in some distant pre-civil rights era, not in a war zone, in a major American city, under a democratically elected government, with television cameras rolling. And somehow, most Americans have never heard of it. In the summer of 1932, at the deepest trough of the Great Depression, approximately 43,000 people descended on Washington, D.C. Most of them were World War I veterans. They had come to petition Congress for early payment of a bonus they had been promised for their military service, a bonus that wasn't scheduled to be paid until 1945. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. The press called them the Bonus Army. They set up a sprawling encampment of tents and shacks along the Anacostia River, just across from the capital. Families came with them, wives, children. It was, by all accounts, an orderly and peaceful demonstration. The veterans organized their own camp, maintained sanitation, held daily roll calls, and flew American flags throughout the encampment. They had fought for their country. They had been gassed in trenches, shelled in no man's land, and shipped home with wounds both visible and invisible. And now, with unemployment at 25% and their families going hungry, they were asking the government they'd fought for to pay what it owed them. Early. Congress debated. The House passed a bill authorizing early payment. The Senate rejected it. Many of the veterans, with nowhere else to go, stayed in their camps. They had no jobs to return to, no homes. In many cases, Washington was, for thousands of them, the last place they had left. President Herbert Hoover wanted them gone. On July 28, 1932, Hoover ordered the Army to clear the veterans from government buildings in downtown Washington, where some had been squatting. The operation was placed under the command of Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, the same MacArthur who would later command Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II. MacArthur exceeded his orders dramatically. Instead of simply clearing the downtown buildings, MacArthur, accompanied by his aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, and cavalry commander Major George S. Patton, led infantry, cavalry, and 6 tanks across the Anacostia Bridge and into the main veteran encampment. Soldiers advanced with fixed bayonets. Cavalry charged on horseback through the camp. And then the Army deployed tear gas, Adamsite gas, a chemical agent that causes vomiting, pain, and respiratory distress. Against American veterans, against their families, against their children. The camp was set ablaze, whether by the soldiers' tear gas canisters or by deliberately set fires remains disputed. What is not disputed is that the Army burned the encampment to the ground. Thousands of veterans, women and children, fled through clouds of tear gas as their makeshift homes went up in flames behind them. 2 veterans were shot and killed during the initial clearing of the downtown buildings. A 12-week-old baby died from the effects of tear gas exposure. Dozens were injured. The entire Bonus Army, 43,000 American citizens, the majority of them men who had served their country in war, was violently dispersed by the military they had once served in. MacArthur, far from expressing regret, held a press conference afterward in which he claimed the Bonus Army had been infiltrated by communists and criminals. He described the operation as necessary to prevent a revolution. Hoover, who had ordered only the limited downtown clearance, reportedly disapproved of MacArthur's escalation. but did not publicly rebuke him. The American public was not sympathetic to the government's position. Newsreel footage of soldiers attacking veterans and their families, images of cavalry charges, burning camps, and tear-gassed children played in theaters across the country. The Bonus Army debacle became one of the defining images of Hoover's presidency and contributed significantly to his landslide defeat by Franklin Roosevelt in the November 1932 election. Roosevelt, once in office, took a different approach. When a second, smaller bonus march arrived in Washington in 1933, Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, to meet with the veterans. He offered them jobs in the newly created Civilian Conservation Corps. The confrontation Hoover had met with tanks. Roosevelt diffused with coffee. The bonus itself was eventually paid in 1936, when Congress overrode Roosevelt's veto to pass the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act. But the image endures. American soldiers, commanded by three men who would become among the most famous military leaders of the 20th century, turning their weapons on the veterans who had preceded them. Bayonets and tear gas deployed not against a foreign enemy, but against Americans who had committed the offense of asking their government to honor a promise. MacArthur became Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific. Eisenhower became President of the United States. Patton became the most celebrated tank commander in American military history. Their roles in the Bonus Army dispersal became footnotes, minor embarrassments in otherwise towering careers. The veterans they gassed and bayoneted received their bonus 4 years late, and the lesson embedded in the event that the government will use military force against its own citizens when it finds their demands inconvenient would echo through Kent State, through Standing Rock, through every confrontation between American power and American people who dared to assemble and petition for redress. Some lessons, it seems, need to be relearned by every generation. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, Midnight Magnates, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues. So, 35 secrets, 35 files from the vault, mind control brothels, government body snatching, lost nuclear bombs, Nazi scientists at NASA, 40-year experiments on men who were never told they were sick, a war that killed 3 million people, started by a lie, the FBI sending suicide letters to a Nobel Peace Prize winner, the Pentagon proposing to bomb its own cities, the government deliberately poisoning its citizens' alcohol for 7 years, psychic spies on the government payroll, secret armies across Europe, a surveillance apparatus that records every phone call, every email, every text message on the planet, an assassination network across an entire continent, a city that dropped a bomb on its own neighborhood and let the children burn, the military bayoneting the veterans who'd fought its wars, and a classified plan, rehearsed, exercised, ready to execute for suspending the Constitution itself. These aren't conspiracy theories. Every single one has been declassified, investigated, formally acknowledged, or admitted to by the United States government itself. Now, there's a pattern here, and if you've been paying attention through all 35 chapters, you've already noticed it. It's the same pattern every time. First, a secret program is created. It operates outside the law, outside oversight, outside the knowledge of the public or even Congress. It continues for years, sometimes decades. Second, a whistleblower breaks ranks. Peter Buxton leaks Tuskegee. Daniel Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers. 8 citizens break into the media, Pennsylvania FBI office. Edward Snowden walks out of the NSA with a thumb drive. Someone, at enormous personal risk, decides that the public's right to know outweighs their own safety. Third, there's outrage, congressional hearings, newspaper headlines, presidential apologies, promises that it will never happen again. Fourth, reforms are enacted, laws are passed, oversight committees are created, boundaries are drawn. And fifth, and this is the part nobody talks about, the cycle repeats. Iran-Contra came after the Church Committee. NSA mass surveillance came after FISA. Enhanced interrogation came after the Prohibition on torture. Every reform creates a temporary boundary that is eventually circumvented, reinterpreted, or simply ignored. See, the Church Committee was supposed to be the definitive correction. 1975. The year America confronted its shadow state and said, "Never again." Frank Church himself believed he was building permanent safeguards. He wasn't. The safeguards lasted about a decade, and then the pattern reasserted itself. New programs, new code names, new legal justifications. The same institutional instincts, the same contempt for transparency, the same calculation that secrecy serves power better than accountability does. The U.S. government classifies approximately 50 million documents every year. That's 3 new classified records every second. And here's the question that should keep you up tonight. If it took 40 years for the Pentagon Papers to be declassified, if it took 62 years for the JFK files to be released, if it took decades for the public to learn about MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Project Sunshine, Broken Arrow, Shamrock, what is being classified right now that your grandchildren will learn about in 2070? Because if there's one thing this video demonstrates, it's that the pattern doesn't stop. It never has. Every generation discovers the previous generation's secrets. Every generation is shocked. Every generation implements reforms. And every generation assumes, genuinely, sincerely believes, that their own government has changed. The evidence suggests otherwise. These are the files they didn't want you to read. And somewhere in a basement in Washington, someone is classifying the files they don't want your grandchildren to read. Sleep well.